Good afternoon, everyone, and I do use that because we are continuing on our special council meeting from this afternoon. We still have 2 items left before we get to the committee of the whole meeting for the 3 informals. And so next up on the continuation of our meeting is item 4C, business plan for integrated planning and public works. Welcome, Mr. Rapp.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski, members of council, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a bigger audience here this evening for IPPW, which is great. Truly, it is. I've got I'm fortunate to be the Commissioner of Integrated Planning and Public Works, and I'm going to introduce really what Integrated Planning and Public Works is about. And then each of the directors responsible for their specific area, their division, will proceed with sort of talking about some of the initiatives that they have identified within their business plan. I'm not going to read what you see in front of you. It's there and it's printed in the books. But essentially, Integrated Planning and Public Works is the department that's responsible for the city's growth management, built form, and infrastructure. All the things that Bill 66 is trying to avoid. There's supposed to be more laughter there, but it is in a way all-inclusive. And when I say that, it goes from visioning for the community of what the community is looking for, right through to key in the door, and that's through occupying a structure. And it goes beyond that. It's actually then into long-term maintenance, and that's with our utilities and transportation section. As a result of those areas, we are a heavy regulated group. We're regulated by the Clean Water Act, the Planning Act, the Environmental Assessment Act, the Internal Building Code Act, the Highway Traffic Act. There's numerous acts that regulate what Integrated Planning and Public Works does. Most of these acts are grounded in public safety or quality of life. And these acts and regulations leads to a very broad group of professionals, staff. We have professional engineers, we have professional planners, geoscientists, landscape architects, building officials, licensed water operators, to name just some of them. But again, a very professional group because of those regulations that we have to perform within. All those staff and associated processes are closely linked, hence the integrated department that we are. When reviewing our operations, our obligations, our processes, and staffing, we've organized ourselves into the 5 different divisions that are planning, engineering, building, city utilities, transportation. And as I said, I'm joined here with the various directors, and they will go over all of some of the key points that we've tried to lay out for 2019. But the one thing I'd like to mention for IPPW as a whole, the one area that we need to focus on, particularly in the next year or 2, is succession planning. The senior management part of IPPW represents over 160 years of experience with an average of about 28 years. So what was a young department 15 years ago is getting long in the tooth, and we are going to have to focus the next year and a half on making sure that we have a strong succession plan to continue with the success and working with the community that we've had for the last number of years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kaminsky, our Chief Building Official, and he can get into the building standards and what they'll be working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Cam. Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. I am Ralph Kaminsky, the Chief Building Official and Director of Building Standards. Building Standards is an enterprise business unit, so we're responsible for the enforcement of the Building Code Act and regulations, but as an enterprise unit, we are to collect the fees to support ourselves independent of the tax base. We've been able to successfully do that since the Building Code Act was introduced in 2005. The Chief Building Official and the members of our team, the building inspectors, are all appointed by council. So we have a special relationship with council. So we got to know each other. In our audience, we have some future applicants, which can appreciate the role of the building inspector and the building department. We're commonly referred to as the gatekeeper. We're the last kick of the can before a building permit is issued and construction is allowed to commence. So our building staff review the application for compliance with the zoning bylaw, the site plan approval process, and other applicable law. That Bill 66, never mind. So we are looking at reviewing the plans and issuing the permit in the most timely manner possible. Sometimes we bounce back and forth the communication with the applicant to resolve issues. Some of the issues we don't resolve or don't influence are quality of material, choices of material, and quality of construction. But once we've deemed the application is complete, we have a predetermined timeline to process the application to make a decision to issue a permit. Once that determination is made and the application is deemed complete, we must issue a building permit. Once a permit is issued, an applicant has certain timeframes that they must adhere to in order to construct their project and complete the project in a timely manner. So I'll move to some of the successes and our key initiatives for 2019. Some time ago, we advanced our online permitting, or changed rather our permitting system to allow for online permit applications. The program was developed for new home construction only. And last year, of the 153 applications that were made for new home construction, 120 of them were made online. So we're hoping to spend some time expanding that this year so that any application can be received online. Last year, we developed a building inspection app for our phone, for our smartphone, that allowed the building inspectors to record their inspection results on site, take photos, take notes, and send that information back to our office and back-end system. We're looking to expand that to allow the builders to do the same. So the builders would be allowed to make their inspection requests via smartphone, and we'd communicate back and forth with technology to the smartphone. Some time ago, we also transferred our vehicles from electric to hybrids. We tried that on because the building reserve account is a healthy account and had money that we could invest a higher dollar value on hybrid vehicles and test that theory. It turned out we didn't see many efficiencies in the hybrid vehicles, but we're looking forward to seeing great success with the electrical vehicles. We tried to purchase a vehicle in 2018. Unfortunately, we didn't have success. Most of the vehicles were already spoken for or had been shipped off the States. We're looking also to create an electric charging station, and asset management will probably describe where that is and how that will look like. That's it, I think, for building standards. I'm going to turn it over to city utilities, and I'll be back later for questions.
Good evening, Mayor Jaworski and members of council. My name is Roy Garbotz, and I am the interim director of City Utilities. Although City Utilities has a vast scope of things that they do, I'm just going to provide a quick oversight of the major ones. City Utilities provides the City of Waterloo with 24/7, 365 emergency response in a number of areas. Water quality, water distribution issues such as water main breaks, wastewater collection issues such as sewer blockages, stormwater conveyance issues such as flooding and spill response, control, and cleanup. We are governed by Ministry of Environment, Conservation, and Park regulations, as well as the Safe Water Drinking Act. We also have a mandated drinking water quality system where we self-audit every year, and every third year we are audited by a provincially approved auditor to ensure compliance for safe, clean drinking water and to maintain our accreditation. Key initiatives going forward in 2019 will be a comprehensive review of our black pipe replacement policy. This lateral material has reached or exceeded its life expectancy, and it may no longer be appropriate for the city to cover the replacement costs. Staff will prepare a report identifying the issues and options for council considerations. Also, the advanced metering infrastructure project for water meters will make improvements to our customer service levels by giving staff information quicker, such as high water consumptions. This project has operated successfully with a pilot program for the last couple of years, and staff will provide an in-depth analysis of the program and options to potentially proceed to citywide implementation. We also have a leak detection project which will provide information on our water main status in strategic locations within the city of Waterloo. Sensors will be placed within hydrants and monitor pressure, temperature, acoustic vibrations within the water distribution system. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Jaworski, members of council. My name is Ron Ormson. I'm the city's Director of Engineering Services. The city's Engineering Services Division provides technical and project management support to each of the other divisions in integrated planning and public works, and also to some other divisions across the city, namely Environment and Park Services and Economic Development. Engineering Services is organized into 3 teams. So we have our Design and Construction Engineering team that deals with road reconstruction, sewer, water main rehabilitation, stormwater management assets, and wastewater expansion projects. We also have our Development Engineering team that deals with new construction associated with site plan development and subdivisions. That team also deals with some larger DC-funded roadworks such as Columbia Street and Willett Street that were recently completed. And that's the section within our division where we also deliver landscape architecture services out of as well. And then lastly but not least, we have the engineering infrastructure section. And that section consists of computer-aided drafting and design services, field surveying, data management, hydraulic modeling, and things needed to assess and prioritize projects. Field inspection services are actually delivered out of all 3 of those sections. So we do camera inspection and water, wet utilities, and of course traditional construction inspection looking at backfilling and pavement quality and things like that. I'd like to point out for council that at the end of 2018, with some of the administrative changes and adjustments that Mr. Anderson mentioned that KPMG, our management consultant, helped us out with, the active transportation and LRT section that was traditionally in engineering has moved over to transportation services. And my colleague Chris Kaler will mention a little bit more about that when she's here momentarily. But it is important to note because in the business plan as written on page 110, you'll see the transportation master plan update listed under engineering. Of course, engineering services is going to be a key collaborator. We're not walking away from it by any means, but it will be delivered primarily from transportation services. In engineering, we have a very close working relationship with all the regulatory agencies. So by that, I mean the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Grand River Conservation Authority, Technical Standards and Safety Authority, and several others. We work very collaboratively with technical staff at the region of Waterloo, especially when there's overlap in surface works and projects involving road reconstruction. I'm happy to say we have a very good and collaborative relationship with faculty and students at the University of Waterloo. So we're active with the Center for Advancement in Trenchless Technology. Recently we met with researchers about autonomous type technology and basically artificial intelligence that will look at potholes and things like that. So we're very lucky to have close ties to U of W. And we do also have a very strong working relationship with private sector consulting engineers. So the Grand River chapter of the Consulting Engineers of Ontario have a number of members that are active here and that provide service delivery to the city where we don't have our own in-house engineering capability. And in fact, in 2017, the local chapter recognized the city with a design award for work that the city had done in Northdale with the master plan. So in 2019, I'll touch on a couple of projects. There are a number of road related items that you will see in the capital budget. What will happen in the springtime, we're going to move back into the field and we're going to complete projects that were initiated and substantially completed in 2018. So we'll be putting surface asphalt on streets like Albert Street and Dale Crescent and those areas where we've been active this past year. And then we're going to move into some new projects, Moxon Drive, portion of Longwood Drive, Nielsen Avenue, and We're going to step up our design work for 2020 construction for a number of other projects. We've got about 5 roads that we're looking at doing in 2020. One of them will include Larch Street in Northdale, which is a very unique street. It's a Werner Street, so it'll be our first shared use street with essentially pedestrian priority and multi-user access for that road. Silver Lake and Laurel Creek Rehabilitation, it's a flagship project that involves many different departments or many different divisions across the city. In fact, all 3 departments have been working on this project. It's such a big one. It's nice to see that the city's communication division has it on the front page of the business plans. But Silver Lake is one of those generational projects. It's worth about $7.3 million. At least we have that budgeted for. And it will involve shoreline restoration, reconfiguration, water quality enhancements, a new 4-bay construction just west of the Ion LRT tracks, and in conjunction with Environment and Parks, a complete rebuild of the Lions Lagoon area on the north side of Silver Lake. So very big project, flagship project involving a lot of stakeholders. Perimeter Institute and others have been consulted widely about it, and we're quite excited about starting it this year. And then lastly, the Stormwater Master Plan is a citywide review of stormwater management assets, creeks, streams, stormwater ponds. And what that plan will do is inform the next 3-year budget and the next 10-year capital forecast about some of the higher value stormwater assets across the city. About 4 years ago, we completed the Stormwater Master Plan, Sanitary Master Plan, and it's been a very useful guidebook to prioritize those precious capital dollars when we need to look at infrastructure renewal. So with that, I will turn it over to Joel Cotter, our Director of Planning Approvals.
Good evening, Mayor Jaworski, members of council. My name is Joel Cotter. I am the Director of Planning. The Planning Division is responsible for planning and designing our community for orderly growth and development, and we strive to make the city of Waterloo a more livable and vibrant community. We shape the built environment, the spatial interactions within the city through planning policy, through the establishment of development regulations, the evaluation of development applications, and collaboration with a wide range of interest groups. Much of the work that we do is controlled by legislation, including, but not limited to, the Planning Act, the Condominium Act, the Heritage Act, and the Municipal Act. So when Mr. Ross said he does a lot of fire suppression, we're often the ones creating the fire. We work very hard to fulfill the city's legal obligations under all of those legislative documents and navigate the complex and ever-evolving legislative framework to advance the city's land use planning objectives. The planning division itself is comprised of 2 sections. First is growth management, and services include visioning and policy planning, heritage planning, environmental planning, and review of provincial and regional policies, plans, and regulations. The second section is the planning approval section, and services include development planning related to zoning, subdivisions, condominiums, and urban design. We do site plan review and approval, zoning and development compliance, committee of adjustment, signed bylaw, including both variances and permits, as well as demolition control and many other services. For 2019, some of the projects that we have listed to work on include an update to our urban design manual. The current urban design manual was adopted in 2009, so it's about a decade old. And it's time to refresh that document, bring it into alignment with contemporary urban design principles, as well as to update it to reflect and align with our more recent planning documents, including the 2012 official plan, as well as the comprehensive zoning bylaw that we updated last year. Second initiative includes updating public notices to evaluate our notification practices. We hear often through our planning applications that we bring to council around individuals wanting enhanced notice or difficulty understanding our notices, and also the mechanisms that we use to notify the public and starting to leverage things like social media to the extent possible. So we're going to work on that initiative. And a third initiative is to initiate an inclusionary zoning study. The province has recently enabled municipalities or given us the tool to deal with inclusionary zoning, which is the provision of zoning or affordable housing units through inclusionary zoning for developments with 10 or more units in them. And one of the requirements is to undertake an assessment report, and that zoning inclusionary zoning study identified is intended to start to frame out that assessment report to build the foundations for potentially incorporating inclusionary zoning within the community. We have many other initiatives. We operate day to day unknowing what applications are going to come in the door, but we've got many applications. If council's got questions, we're happy to answer those, and I'll pass it over to Chris Kaler, Director of Transportation Services.
Good evening. My name is Christine Kaler, and I'm the Director for Transportation Services. Transportation is responsible for all of the surface infrastructure within the road right-of-way, from the back of the sidewalk to the back of the sidewalk. We are currently split into 3 sections. Transportation Operations is responsible for roadway and sidewalk maintenance, including snow clearing, street sweeping, traffic sign installation, as well as road closures. Transportation Engineering is responsible for road occupancy permits, traffic requests, crossing guards, street lighting, and on-street parking. And our newest section, Active and Autonomous Transportation, is responsible for the design and construction of transportation projects such as infill sidewalks and traffic calming measures, as well as pedestrian and cycling initiatives. Some of our key initiatives for 2019 are decorative street lighting for the Sandown-Braemore neighborhood. In 2017, approximately 8,000 high-pressure sodium Cobra head streetlights were converted to LED, resulting in energy and maintenance cost savings. There are approximately 1,200 decorative streetlights still waiting for changes in technology to allow us to replace them with a financially responsible alternative. In the Sandown-Braemore neighborhood, the decorative style lighting was installed in the 1970s. It is no longer available, and we are experiencing issues with the underground infrastructure. We will be reviewing the current lighting levels and determining how to replace the existing lights and poles with more energy-efficient fixtures, which will assist us in both energy and maintenance costs going forward. Changes to Ontario Regulation 239/02, the minimum maintenance standards for municipal highways in 2018, has resulted in increased maintenance responsibilities for both winter and summer operations. An example of one of these changes is the introduction of winter maintenance standards for bike lanes, including the removal of snow. Based on the road class, we now have between 12 and 24 hours to clear the bike lanes, depending on how much snow has fallen. So as an example, Father David Bauer Drive would be a Class 4 road. These lanes would need to be cleared when there's 8 centimeters of snow and must be completed within a 24-hour time period. And lastly, our Transportation Master Plan update. The update of the TMP will build on the work completed in 2011 and is expected to commence within the next few weeks. Some key goals of the plan are to develop a transportation network that is accessible for all ages and abilities, and one which meets the needs of the present while planning for the future. Improve road safety for all users through complete streets and Vision Zero principles and practices. Establish an implementation plan that focuses on community priorities, is fiscally responsible, and aligns with the objectives of the city's asset management plan. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Rapp.
Thanks, Christine. That concludes a very brief summary and presentation of what IPPW is responsible for and some of the key projects each division hopes to undertake in 2019. The group of us are more than happy to answer any questions that council might have. And if we can't provide an answer this evening, as noted before, we can provide an answer very shortly and get back to council with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapp and team. First out of the gate is Councillor Bonagor.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, if I could make a request leading into the February meetings, would it be possible to get a breakdown of our total spend on multimodal transportation and active transportation?
Absolutely.
That would be great. Thank you.
Councillor Freeman.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. Mr. Rapp, thank you to your team for your presentations. They were great. one of the things I wanted to better understand, and it's kind of a combined question between your department and Mr. Dykstra's department, but it's with regard to the allocation of overhead expenses to utilities. And I know that there was going to be a staff report done on that, and I don't recall seeing it, but I'm just trying to get a sense down the pipe, like when we look at the operating budget, like how that transfer is happening and how much is happening, and whether there's opportunities, whether that report identifies opportunities for reduction and that kind of thing.
Working with the finance group, each of our utility divisions, like building standards as well as city utilities, so our, if you will, the business utilities. We've been working with finance. We've developed general overhead costing. We're working towards trying to align them between what should be a proper cost recovery from the utility versus the tax base. So we are going through that process. It's started to be implemented the last couple of years. It's a slow migration, if you will, instead of like flicking a switch and converting everything at time. Some of the divisions need time to absorb certain costs that maybe if they haven't been paying their share of an overhead cost. So it's been an evolving process, but we can provide additional information to you prior to budget consideration later this spring.
And just to follow up to that, I just wondered, we were talking in the strategic plan about the timesheets and changing how timesheets are entered and so on. And it would be insightful to know whether or not that work also identifies savings, shall we say.
Certainly, we can provide that information coming forward. I think is the budget day, the 21st. We can make sure we provide some additional information before then.
Councillor Bodley, Councillor Vasek after.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. Understanding that we're going to be talking more about the capital budget at a future date. Just a quick question, though. One of the largest things that I've heard from residents in the community is with respect to traffic calming. I have a gigantic list of areas that have been identified as concerns by residents. And I note in the capital budget that there's ongoing funding to be released for traffic calming implementation and studies. And I'd like some feedback from you and perhaps Chris with respect to whether or not those funds are sufficient to be able to accomplish the goals that the residents are asking of us.
To answer that, the last part first, the funds probably are not sufficient to address the needs of the community. However, we previously had additional funding. I think this year it's going for it at about $80,000 a year, which generally will allow us to do one traffic calming project. And what we found is we did have additional money, but the actual work involved going into the neighborhood and having the public meetings and the iterations of decisions or options, if you will, for the community and for council to consider. It was all we could really do was one a year, to be honest, because they are extremely volatile processes, as I'm sure you can be aware. So we found we could actually only pull off one a year. The one thing I can say is that we're dealing with the backlog, if you will, through that $80,000 a year, but all new subdivisions for probably the last 5 or 6 years, if not a decade, have had traffic calming built in as subdivision conditions. So we have that as a go forward, but we still have a backlog, and the funding is not adequate to meet all the needs, but the funding is appropriate given what we can actually pull off every year.
Councillor Vasek.
Yeah, thanks again to your team. That was exciting. I didn't think I would be that interested in IPPW, honestly, because I'm a community person, but I'm finding it all really fascinating. So
It is.
Okay, I have 2 questions. When is the inclusionary zoning assessment report process planned for?
The inclusionary zoning that Mr. Cotter referred to, it's been identified as one of our joint services initiative to work with the City of Kitchener So whenever you're doing something together with another party, the alignment and the timing and the resources always is sort of the slowest. It's the slowest common denominator, if you will. We do hope to have a lot of work done in 2019. Again, because it's a process, I don't want to speculate what the outcome might be or the timing, because council and the community could ask for further revisions or further public meetings. But we'd like to see something brought forward to the council, this council, in 2019, if Kitchener can keep up, if you will. If we want to maintain total control over the timing, then we would want to pull it out of that joint services initiative. But I think there's a lot of benefit in this one to keep together.
Okay, thank you. I hope they can keep up because it's a really important one. My second is around, the lights, the LED lighting for Sandown Braemar, because it is in Ward 5. And so I guess I was just curious if there is a community consultation plan for it, what that might look like.
That I will have to refer to Mrs. Kaler.
We will be doing public consultation. It's a big neighborhood, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of thoughts as to what type of lighting should go into the neighborhood. But first we have to find out what we can do in the neighborhood and then present it to them.
Councillor Veith, please.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, it's for Chris as well. I just wondered, the lighting project, those lights were installed in the 70s, and I just wondered, I know there are other neighborhoods that have similar aged lighting, and is it because these ones are giving you trouble right now that they're kind of at the top?
These ones, we call them the top hat. There are no other lights like them within the city, so that's why we've chosen that neighborhood. The decorative lighting that is that's left to be changed over to LED, most of it is, I'll say, fairly new, within the last 20 years. So at this point, it's not ready to be replaced, and the LED options for those decorative lights are not really economically feasible at this time. So we're waiting until they can come up with a better LED option, similar to what we did with the Cobra heads.
And then a question from me. About 2 or 3 times a year, a resident will experience a high water use event. In other words, a massive water bill. And when we last had that about 6-7 months ago, I was speaking to some staff and about how other municipalities approach it, and some create a budget line item for helping out residents with that. Is that part of your program for this for 2019?
Yes. Staff will be reaching out to other communities. We're aware of some of the programs that our communities already have, and we'll evaluate those, come forward to council with a couple of options, with a preferred option from a staff perspective for council to consider.
Thank you. Last call for questions for IPPW. Oh, Councillor Henry.
Many of mine have been asked by my colleagues, so thank you. Just last one I had for Mr. Cotter, and I think we've gone back and forth on this, and Cam, if you've got it, go ahead. I see that there's certainly a need in your division that you've identified for additional planning resources and support because of the volume that's coming in that's generating this extra revenue. I know that the extra revenue doesn't quite pay for the extra staffing, but I was looking for a comment on what an additional position for a senior planner might do to some of our external costs. I'm thinking about the LPAT and some others, whether we can expect some positive returns from that investment beyond just the immediate raw dollars.
I think I will refer that question to Mr. Cotter for the details.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry. It's a good question. The planning division is experiencing a very high demand or high volume of development applications these days. We're trying to keep our head above water, but we are doing more and more work in-house. We've accomplished most recently the comprehensive zoning bylaw primarily in-house with little external resources with, in my view, substantial cost savings to the municipality, but also a better product at the end through the collaboration with internal divisions. Dealing with high volumes of LPAT hearings right now, as well as court proceedings, are also a challenge for the division. And again, one hearing, it would not be unreasonable to expect six-figure type costs to hire outside consultants to defend the city on some of these planning related matters, both before LPAT or the courts. So there certainly is in-house savings that would be generated. I can't necessarily quantify that for council this evening, but if that's something you'd like us to look at in more detail, we'll do our best to do that.
And I think in terms of what might be helpful as additional information for myself and hopefully for council on budget day would be a sense of what our last 5 or so years of expenses out of the OMB now LPAT reserve look like, because I see we are going back and re-adding some dollars that we're contributing. So trying to get a sense of whether or not something could be sustainable a little bit lower. So I think additional information would help.
With that, thank you very much, Mr. Raff. Thanks to the team as well. Thanks for staying for the evening. But before you leave, Joel, next up, Planning Act training, overview of informal and formal public meetings, which is completely relevant to tonight, since that's all we have tonight is informal public meetings. And so welcome, Joel, for our short training session.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski and members of council. Provide a brief, as I call it, a condensed overview of some of the city planning work that we undertake on a day, just to give council a reference point. There are 3 informal public meetings this evening, so hopefully it'll give you a bit of guidance on some of the things that govern the planning process and how it operates. Land use planning affects almost every aspect of life in the city of Waterloo. It determines where homes and businesses and parks and schools will be built. It regulates how parcels of land will be developed, and it guides the form and the character of that development. It also is a key initiative to the protection of significant natural resources, as well as heritage and cultural resources. And we do our best to balance both the interests of the individual that's advancing the application or an individual property owner against the wider interests and objectives of the entire community. And in essence, good planning leads to orderly growth and development. The role of the city is to prepare planning documents to guide the growth and the development, such as the official plan and the zoning bylaw, to ensure that our planning decisions and documents are consistent with upper tier legislation, including the province and the region, to engage the public and stakeholders in the local planning process, and of course for council to make local planning decisions. From the planning framework, it starts with the Planning Act, moves into provincial policy statements, followed through to the growth plan. So the blue are the provincial level, moving on to the regional official plan, and then the dark gray is the city official plan, followed by secondary plans or district plans, zoning bylaw, and site plan. And I'll provide a little bit more detail on each of those moving forward. The Planning Act sets out the ground rules for land use planning within Ontario and describes how lands may be controlled and who has the authority to control them. It provides a land use planning system led by provincial policy. And ultimately, the way the Planning Act is structured is that municipalities can't refuse applications with a few exceptions. So if someone wants to file an application, the city's obligated to take that application and move it through the planning process in a fair and balanced way. We do provide planning processes that are fair, trying to make them open, accessible, timely, and efficient and transparent. And we ultimately, through the Planning Act, require a host of tests. One of those tests at the end of the decision-making time period is that council or the decision authority states the reasons for the decisions that they're making. Development applications that are advanced to the city are open to the public, so the public has the right to review them. Any other decision makers, so should there be an appeal to the local planning appeals tribunal, which is LPAT, they must have regard for council's decision, and likewise, council must have regard for the provincial planning framework that's been established pursuant to Section 2 of the Planning Act. The timeframes for advancing development applications are for zoning amendments 150 days, official plans 210 days, draft plans of subdivision 180 days, and site plan control 30 days. If decisions are not made within that time frame or those time frames, often the applicant has the right to appeal to an upper jurisdiction. In terms of planning engagement, the Planning Act establishes the requirement for one public meeting to inform and obtain the views of the public. There are, again, a few exceptions to that rule. And typically, it requires notices by mail and by signage. For Committee of Adjustment applications, the notification distance is 60 meters. For almost all other applications, it's 120 meters. The Planning Act also allows the municipalities to establish alternative regulations, and the city has seized this opportunity through our official plan to create a two-stage system where we engage the community and secure views. First is an informal public meeting, and the second is a formal public meeting. I'll speak to those shortly. We also go beyond the Planning Act requirements, and we do notification by mail, signage, newspapers, as well as on the web page. And again, these notification procedures and distances, those are all things that we'll be looking at in planning approvals as indicated in the business plan presentation. The planning process starts with a pre-application consultation meeting with staff to discuss the concept of the vision. It moves forward to a formal submission with a complete application. There's an agency circulation that's undertaken, so circulating the GRCA, for example. And then preliminary issues are identified, and we move to an informal public meeting. In that informal public meeting, there's 3 of them on this evening. These are meetings where staff are presenting the applicant's submission. These are the applicant's proposals. They are not staff's proposals. We're presenting them for information purposes only. Council's not taking a position or making a decision. It's to present them for information to allow those to understand the applications and to provide more meaningful feedback moving forward. Following the informal public meeting, we get into, again, further stakeholder and public engagement, followed by issues resolution, the preparation of a staff report, and this is usually where staff formally takes its position. So through the process to this point, staff haven't taken a position on the application. We're simply there listening, reviewing, trying to identify issues and understanding viewpoints. That ultimately leads to the formal public meeting. And this is typically where council will consider, again, further input from those that are interested, the stakeholders and the applicant, ask questions, and ultimately close that hearing and make a decision. And then following the formal public meeting, in most instances, there's an appeal period. So that's essentially the planning processes. Again, we've taken that alternative procedures approach and created 2 opportunities for engagement. With respect to appeals, most appeals are 20 days, and it's limited to those that typically make written or oral submissions at the public meetings or to the city, and the appeals have to have merit at the end of the day or deemed to be valid before the new LPAT. Those that are participating in the planning system, if it's an official plan amendment or a zoning bylaw amendment, subdivision, variance, or consent, which are both for the Committee of Adjustment, those processes allow the participant to appeal. If it's lifting of a holding symbol or site plan, only the applicant can appeal. And for certain other types of application, there is no right to appeal. So whether it's a heightened density bonusing request, temporary use bylaws, cash in lieu of parking, or part lot control exemptions. So there's, again, varying degrees of who can appeal and under what circumstances. Most of the applications before council this evening relate to subdivisions and zoning, which means participants that are working their way through the process would have an opportunity to appeal if they were not satisfied with the ultimate outcome. Briefly on the provincial policy statement, again, it sets the provincial direction with respect to land use planning. It deals with strong communities in terms of housing densities, the protection of employment areas, deals with resource management in terms of the natural heritage, water, agricultural lands, cultural heritage, and it also deals with public health and safety. And the provincial policy statement also requires the municipality to maintain a 10-year supply of designated lands and a 3-year supply of lands that are zoned for residential development and intensification. Moving on at the provincial level to the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. This is a more specific provincial plan scoped to the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and it focuses on building compact and vibrant and complete communities. It sets a minimum 40% growth target within the built-up area, so we're moving inward through infill and intensification. It deals with population and employment growth targets for the region. It requires a comprehensive review, which is at the regional level, for the conversion of employment lands. So before council this evening is employment subdivision. You cannot convert that subdivision under provincial law to non-employment purposes without going through a municipal comprehensive review. And council's decisions must conform to the growth plan. And again, for the Uptown, it's the urban growth center for the municipality, and it is planned to have the greatest level of intensification with 200 persons and jobs combined per hectare. The regional official plan essentially deals with planning matters of regional interest, so groundwater, urban growth centers, transit-oriented development, major commercial centers, cultural resources, those types of issues. The City of Waterloo's official plan is our long-range comprehensive planning document. It's the framework that we use to make land use planning decisions in the city. It sets the vision for growth and change within the community, and all bylaws and all actions, so capital works of council, must conform to the city's official plan under the Planning Act. It contains principles and objectives and policies designed and directed to direct the form, extent, and nature and rate of growth and development within the city to 2031. And again, our official plan must conform to the region's official plan. In the official plan, there's a host of designations with respect to residential, essentially low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise. With respect to commercial, working from the top clockwise, Uptown is the core commercial designation, moving to community centers, neighborhood centers, mixed-use office, corridor commercial, which is highway commercial, and then two specific destination-oriented commercial facilities, both the Boardwalk and Conestoga Mall. Within the employment areas, there's three core designations: business employment, so those are the knowledge-based industries; flexible industrial, which is your traditional industrial; and then as well as academic, so your post-secondary institutions. And there's also policies around institutional land uses, parks, and open space. The district plans then take that level of information in the official plan and drive it to more detail in trying to implement those objectives and policies set out in the official plan. And they deal more specifically with population and density targets. They try and identify in a more refined way the location of community services, commercial and other uses, identification of environmental functions and systems, as well as active transportation systems and general road alignments. And the graphic that's provided is the Beaver Creek Meadow district plan, most recently completed by the city. We also get into specialized plans, so we look at areas that aren't necessarily district plans. We look at things like the station areas that are generated around ION or LRT stations. We've done a heritage conservation district in the McGregor-Albert neighborhood. We've also initiated other studies like the Laurel-Clare Special Policy Area to deal with floodplaining, essentially university to university through the core area. So there's lots of specialized plans that we also undertake. One of those was the height and density policy study in the mid-2000s, and that's where the graphic on the left shows the city growing out. And in 2000, we realized that we were nearing our municipal boundaries, and we started to redirect growth inward and upward. And again, growth is directed per our planning documents towards nodes and corridors with the intention of protecting interior neighborhoods, as well as to allow for more mixed-use neighborhoods. And special studies include things like the recently completed comprehensive zoning bylaw. In terms of land uses in built form, those are generally regulated through zoning bylaws, variances, and site plan. Zoning determines how land may be used, the types of buildings that are permitted and how those buildings may be used, lot sizes, dimensions, where buildings can be located, height, density, bulk, spacing and character of buildings, and parking and loading requirements. Zoning must comply with the official plan. It's black and white. It's essentially limited flexibility. It states that there's a minimum or a maximum requirement. Those are essentially set, and you cannot apply conditions to zoning. So on that matter of conditions, where can you apply conditions under planning? You can apply them through subdivisions, condominiums, consents, variances, and site plan to a limited extent. You cannot apply conditions to official plan or amendments thereto, the zoning bylaw or pot lot control exemptions. You can apply quasi-conditions, is what I would call, to height and density bonusing applications. You cannot people zone. You cannot pass bylaws that have the effect of distinguishing between people. So you'll no longer see antiquated terms of single-family housing. It's single detached housing or senior residence. It's assisted living facilities. Those types of people zoning or distinctions between persons is not permitted under law. The zoning bylaw under the current system must contain provisions related to second units on the basis of advancing affordable housing requirements. And there is the authority to prohibit certain land uses unless municipal services are available. With respect to legal nonconforming, just briefly on this point, if a use exists and we pass a new zoning bylaw that says that use or that building is no longer permitted on the property, that use or the building can continue to be there as a legal nonconforming structure. And the second point is that if you've got a building permit in your hand, you can build whatever that building permit authorizes you to do, despite passing zoning after the fact. The building permit is still valid. And if you want to modify legal nonconforming structures or buildings or land, you can do that either through amendment to the zoning bylaw or through authority under the Committee of Adjustment. Briefly, holding provisions allow council to establish zoning bylaws, save and accept the need for something. For example, the land use may be authorized by the zoning bylaw until services are available, and the holding bylaw restricts development until those services are made available. Section 37 deals with height and density bonusing increases. It allows the municipality to increase density or height beyond those limits in the bylaw, subject to the provision of community benefits. Temporary use bylaws allow council to establish on a temporary basis up to 3 years use of land that may not otherwise be contemplated. And Section 40 allows for parking exemptions, typically commonly referred to as cash in lieu of parking. So council can reduce a parking rate in lieu of a payment to the municipality. The Committee of Adjustment is another vehicle to allow relief to the zoning. The main point is there's 4 tests to dealing with variances. One of them is being minor, but minor is not a numerical test. It's a test related to impact to the immediate area and character of the development that's being proposed or the variance being requested. Site plan is a technical review process. It deals with plans, elevations, and cross sections specific to a property. It applies to new development, mid-size to high-rise residential, commercial, and industrial development, as well as additions and alterations that substantially increase the size or usability of those existing developments. And it deals with things like massing, exterior design, landscaping, site furniture, refuge, garbage, parking, bicycle locations, those types of elements that are detailed and specific to the plan. Those provisions are outlined in the city's urban design manual. It sets a high standard of urban design for the city, and it deals with things like massing and built form, emphasizing the base and the podium of buildings to create good streetscapes, context-sensitive design, articulated facades, landscaping, and more specific criteria around shadow, lighting, and those types of elements. With respect to land division, you have a plan of subdivision before you. There's 4 ways to subdivide land under law. 1 is a plan of subdivision. 2nd is a consent or a severance through the Committee of Adjustment. Part lot control is the division of blocks previously created through a plan of subdivision. And legislative authority. So council has authority to subdivide and create parcels of land as an exemption to plans of subdivision under the Planning Act. So if council wants to create a lot, it can do so under its authority under the Planning Act. The region is the delegated approval authority for plans of subdivision, and subdivisions are considered, again, against the matters of provincial interest, conformity to the official plan, suitability for subdividing the lots, the shapes of the lots, the conservation of natural resources, the ability to access the lands and service the lands, and again, other planning considerations around good design. Condominiums are another form of property ownership. Title to a unit is held by a person with a share of interest in a common, or share for, So it's an individual who's got title to a unit, and then they have a common element. So they've got an element within the condominium that is shared by all. And it's a means of dividing property. It applies equally to residential, commercial, and industrial properties. And you must have a unit and a common element, and often there's exclusive use areas as well. It's an administrative process, so there's no public consultation for condominiums, and again, the region is the approval authority for the city of Waterloo. Parkland dedication, essentially we can require parkland conveyances. For commercial and industrial it's 2%, residential it's 5%. There's an alternative rate for higher intensification in residential lands. we can withhold a building permit until the conveyance has been made, and the valuation is the day before essentially the building permit or the draft approval has been given. And we can apply it equally for increases in density. So wrapping up, some common discussion points, parking through the chambers. When we bring planning applications, you're often going to hear questions around parking and the requirement for parking to meet the demands of the site and the development. The rates have been lowered through the heightened density through the mid-2000s, and again, we lowered them through the comprehensive zoning bylaw review, reflecting the modal shift that's existing out there in the community. Parking reductions, again, are context sensitive. They're often minimum standards, and they reflect our movement towards a more transit supportive and reduced reliance on the automobile, as well as to mitigate climate change. And there's lots of trends around parking, so parking is not something that's static, it's an evolving, continual and ongoing discussion. Heightened density, again, as we move inward and up, heightened density is often a conversation point in the chambers around intensification, whether development is transit supportive, the step backs, the tower dimensions, the built form, the densities, as well as some asset management and how the infrastructure, the capital works are required to support the level of intensification that's being advanced. Urban design is always an issue that's brought forward in terms of what the buildings look like and how they interact and the streetscapes that they create. Environment and climate change, whether it's the protection of natural features, the trees and the bees, or moving to, in the reference to the building, Evolve 1, net zero carbon buildings and sustainable building designs around mitigating climate change and more sustainable development. And again, transportation will be another common theme, whether it's ion and accommodating ion, sidewalks, trail systems, accommodating vehicles, or roundabouts in the design of roads to move traffic through the network system in the city as well as through local roads. And finally, economic development is always another pillar of sustainable development. We look at the economic development impacts of development and how they relate with our partners in economic development in the CAO's office. So that concludes my kind of quick presentation. Hopefully that gives you a benchmark to understand some of the planning applications that are coming forward and how the process is set up. What I will say is our door is always open. There's lots of questions. This is the tip of the iceberg for planning, so feel free to come down and talk to us at any time.
Well, I feel like I've just passed first year planning at the University of Waterloo, so it's good. Questions for Joel? Well, I feel like I've taken it anyways. Councillor Vasic.
Thank you. Yeah, just in that, the process with the circles.
Yeah.
You can go back to it or you don't have to. My question is maybe what the rationale is about stakeholder and public engagement coming after the informal public meeting. And like the reason why I ask is it just seems like counterintuitive to me that you would have the stakeholder and public engagement coming after informal public meeting, because then it doesn't give people the opportunity or as much opportunity to come to the informal public meeting as well after they've had a consultation with in this planning process.
Sure. Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Vasic. It's a good question. The planning system that we've established from a time scale perspective, moving when the application is submitted and complete to the informal public meeting is usually in the time period of about a month and a half. So we're moving very quickly that front part of the process to get the application and the information out there to the community. We'll accept input from day one all the way through to when we complete our staff report and make a presentation to council. But ultimately, if someone has enough information and they want to give us input earlier, we'll certainly take that. That front part of the planning process, though, is structured to get the information out there so people can start reviewing it, understanding it, asking questions, engaging the city in trying to identify issues of concern to them or supportive elements that they like, that they would like to see followed through. And again, that process, the kind of the second line down, is a much lengthier process. So from the engagement through to issues resolution and the staff report, that often can take half a year, for example, to work through that section. So the graphic isn't necessarily well represented from a timeline perspective, but we will take input from anyone who wants to provide us input all the way through the process. Sure. So
through the issues resolution and staff report, are the developers or whoever represents the developers involved in that portion? Like, how does the public interact with developers if they don't come to the public or the informal public meeting?
Through your Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Vasic. It's tailored to each individual development application, how we engage the public. Sometimes it's one or two individuals that will engage one-on-one. Other times there's neighborhoods that are concerned and they'll create a representative group that we deal with. Often there's iterations of plans that are going back and forth and the plans are changing through the process. And so again, we try and update and continue that dialogue of saying, here's the latest iteration. Has it resolved your concerns? Does it still maintain the elements that you liked about the development through the process? But again, planning is difficult because there's so much information that's coming through, and we really are going to take a try through our business plan to look at how we notify and how we engage and how we keep those communication lines open all the way through the process. So the tools that are becoming available to do that, we're going to try and leverage them to the extent that we can. But our objective is to inform people and educate people so they can provide their fair comments to council and allow council to make effective decisions.
Seeing no further questions. Thank you very much, Joel. And now with that, we are completing this section with the bylaw to pass, to confirm proceedings of council for a special council meeting. Moved by Councillor Henry, second by Councillor Bodley. All those in favor? That's all of us, including Jen. Councillor Vasic, there we go. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Bonagor, Councillor Veith, we're adjourned. Oh, all in favor, we're adjourned. Okay, 1 minute while I move desks.
Are we ready? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Committee of the Whole meeting for 2019. Is there a disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof? Councillors? Seeing none. Approval of some minutes, September 10th, 2018, Committee of the Whole meeting. Councillor Henry, Mayor Jaworski, all in favor? Carried. We have no delegations, we have no presentations, and no consent motion. Let me turn the page. No staff reports, but we do have informal public meetings. So the first one is the official plan amendment number 25 and zoning bylaw amendment application Z1818 164 and 168 King Street South and 8 George Street, your neighborhood credit union. I'll just read what I have to read here. This is an informal public meeting to consider item 7A, as I just read. There will be no decisions made tonight. Council and the public are seeing this application for the first time. Council is looking for feedback from interested parties with respect to this application. Tonight's comments will be taken into consideration in developing a staff position on this application, and a staff report will be considered by Council during a formal public meeting at a future meeting. All property owners within 120 meters of the subject lands and anyone who signs the registry will receive notice of the formal public meeting. Anybody who wants further notice of this application, including the formal public meeting and passage of any bylaw, should sign the appropriate registry located on the desk at the rear of the council chambers. If there is more than one registry, please make sure you are signing the appropriate one. The planner, Rita Zylock, will now provide a brief overview of the application. Welcome, Rita. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Chair Weith. Mayor Jaworski, members of council, ladies and gentlemen, this is an informal public meeting for 164, 168 King Street South and 8 George Street. Official Plan Amendment 25 and Zoning Bylaw Amendment Z1818. The application was submitted by your neighborhood credit union, represented here tonight by Trevor Hawkins of MHBC Planning. The subject site is outlined for you in red on this slide. It is located on the northeast corner of King Street South and George Street at the eastern edge of the Uptown Growth Center, or primary node. The primary node is outlined for you in blue in this slide. This is a close-up of the subject site, which is a consolidation of 3 lots. 164 and 168 King Street South are located within the Uptown Growth Center, while 8 George Street is located just outside the primary node. The subject site is uniquely situated with frontage on George Street, King Street South, and Kuntz Lane, with the LRT track running along King Street and the nearest LRT stop located at Allen and King. In terms of surrounding lands, the subject site is surrounded by the Urban Good Funeral Home and Brewmeister's Green to the west. Heritage Green and small-scale office building are located to the northwest. The regional pumping station is located to the north. Single-detached, semi-detached dwellings, a small-scale apartment building, and a church are located to the east and northeast. And finally, the Circa development, currently under construction. Over here, small-scale and large-scale office buildings are located to the south. These are pictures of 2 of the properties. 164 King Street South is currently used as a surface parking lot, and 168 King Street South is occupied by your neighborhood credit union and attached apartments. The building at 168 King Street King Street South does have some historical significance, as it is listed on the Municipal Heritage Register. And finally, this is 8 George Street. Currently, there's a single detached house on the property. This is a conceptual perspective of the proposed development. The applicant is proposing to build a 9-story mixed-use building on the site containing 36 residential units, 810 square meters of commercial space, and 36 parking spaces. This is a conceptual site plan of the proposed development. On the ground floor, the commercial or office space would address King Street South. Surface parking is proposed in behind the building on what it is 164 King Street South over here and 8 George Street here. Parking is also proposed underneath a cantilevered portion of the building over here, and there are 3 access points proposed to the parking. 1 off of George, and 2 off of Kuntz Lane. In terms of the official plan, 164 and 168 King Street South are designated commercial and more specifically uptown mixed use. This designation does permit the proposed mixed use development. 8 George Street is designated low density residential, which allows for singles, semis, and towns, but does not permit the mixed use building being proposed. In terms of zoning bylaw 2018-50, also known as the new zoning bylaw for the city, the subject site is zoned zone change application, or ZC. This is because the application was received and deemed complete prior to council approval of the new citywide zoning bylaw. The intent of the ZC zone is to ensure that the zoning regulations applicable to the site the day before the effective date of the new zoning bylaw continue to apply. Prior to the new zoning bylaw coming into effect, 164 and 168 King Street South was zoned commercial 212, while 8 George Street was zoned general residence 2A. This table on this slide shows the requested official plan designation for 8 George Street, outlined for you in the purple column, while the existing official plan designation is shown in the gray column. Through their request, the applicant is essentially asking to bring 8 George Street into the primary node and has requested all the designations that currently apply to the King Street properties on 8 George Street. But the applicant is asking to limit the height permission on 8 George Street to 6 stories or 20 meters. In terms of the requested zone change, through their submission, the applicant is requesting to rezone 8 George Street from General Residence 2A to Commercial 212 with site-specific provisions, and to rezone 164 and 168 King Street South from Commercial 212 to Commercial 212 with site-specific provisions. The table in this slide breaks down the requested site-specific zoning, shown in purple for you, while the C2 zone requirements and the U2 zone requirements are shown in gray. The U2 zone is essentially the equivalent of the C2 zone in the new zoning bylaw. So the requested site specifics. The applicant is requesting a front yard setback of 4 meters along King Street, which aligns with the U2 zone, while the C2 zone requires 5 meters. The landscape buffer requested is an average of 1.5 meters, while the U2 zone and C2 zone require 3-meter average landscape buffer along the low-rise residential lot lines. A minimum amenity area of 3 square meters per bedroom is being requested, again to align with the U2 zone, while the C2 zone requires 25 square meters per dwelling unit. A commercial parking rate of 1.23 spaces per 100 square meters is being requested, while the U2 zone requires 1.5 spaces per 100 square meters, and the C2 zone requires 3 spaces per 100 square meters. The residential parking rate being requested is 0.7 spaces per unit, which would be split into 0.6 spaces per unit for the residential component and 0.1 spaces for the visitor component. This would align with the U2 zone, while the C2 zone requires 1 space per unit. The applicant is also requesting to change the measure of density to bedrooms per hectare, which would align with the U2 zone and with the official plan. Finally, again, the applicant is requesting to limit the height on 8 George Street to 6 stories or 20 meters. These are the reports and plans submitted by the applicant. All of this information is available on the city's zone change website, and the information is currently being reviewed by city staff, regional staff, and the GRCA. Through the processing of this development application, staff is looking to work with the applicant to secure a public walkway connection between Heritage Green and the regional pumping station, in accordance with the draft Uptown Public Realm strategy. Also, given the location of the proposed building on a highly visible site, one that is a gateway into the Uptown core, staff is looking to work with the applicant to achieve a high standard of urban design for the proposed development. This would include, but is not limited to, high-quality materials on the building, an activated ground floor, and a building that is designed with human scale in mind. In terms of next steps, staff will complete a review of the reports and plans submitted. Staff will assess the requested official plan amendment and zone change to determine the proposed, whether the proposed development constitutes good planning. Staff will consider any feedback received from the public, commenting agencies, and any questions or comments received from council tonight. Then staff will prepare a staff report and hold a public meeting, a formal public meeting, at which point council would make the final decision on this application. That concludes my presentation. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you for that. So do any councillors have questions for staff? Please remember this is an informal public meeting and only questions of clarification may be asked. Council members should not express opinions at this time. So, Mayor Jaworski, we'll start with you.
Maybe Rita, you could review that 8 George Street. When I saw earlier in your presentation, I thought it was going to be a parking lot, and then I see they're asking for a height differential there. Was I mistaken about that? What is being built on 8 George?
No, you're correct. This is 8 George Street right here.
Yeah.
A parking lot is being proposed. There's no components of the building as it's proposed now, proposed on that portion of the site. I'm just relaying the request of the applicant. That's what they're asking for, is to limit it to the 20 meters.
Okay, thank you. And second, the heritage features of the building, do you happen to know offhand? You said it was heritage listed or heritage designated?
It is listed, and my understanding, the reason for it being listed was that it was one of the first apartment buildings within the city of Waterloo. There was an HIA prepared, and that has gone through the Heritage Committee for review.
Thanks.
Councillor Bonagar, sorry.
It's okay, first time. Can I go through
It's
you for
usually
this, or
for-
can I just?
yeah, oh, yeah.
Through you, Councillor Leith, or Chair. I'm just curious, given that this property will be fronting onto essentially 3 streets, it's fronting onto King, it's fronting onto Kuntz Lane, it's fronting onto George, how is it assessed that King will be the front? And does that pertain, given that both addresses, even the ones on Kuntz are officially King Street addresses, is it all frontage?
It is all frontage, but the front yard, or the front of the lot, is the shortest lot line. It doesn't mean that the building shouldn't address George Street or Kuntz Lane. It just means, like, when I refer to the front yard setback, I'm referring to that King Street setback.
Councillor Bassick.
Through you, Chair. What's an activated ground floor?
An activated ground floor would be like this office area here. There is active space there instead of just space that's dead space or unusable space, or something that people can interact with. They feel like they're walking beside it and they can relate to it.
Any other questions from council? Councillor Freeman.
Sorry, it was just, I just wanted to know, like, do you use the acronym HIA? And I'm thinking that not everyone might know what that is. So could you just help?
Definitely. It's a heritage impact study, or impact assessment, HIA.
Okay, I have a question to the heritage bit. Has that gone to the heritage committee? Is it still in process, or have they ruled?
They had made a decision, and I think the final decision lies with council. I'm not sure if the item has come to council yet, but they have prepared a motion, and they were prepared to support the application.
Okay, thank you. And could you go back to slide 12?
Yep.
Please.
Forward.
So can you just explain the amenity area? I don't understand. 25 square meters per dwelling unit.
Right.
And then the other ones are per bedroom.
That's
they're much smaller.
That's right. So again, the purple column represents the request by the applicant, 3 square meters per bedroom. The new zoning bylaw requires 3 square meters per bedroom, but the C2 zone in the old zoning bylaw, that was the zoning bylaw in effect when the applicant submitted the application, was 25 square meters per dwelling unit. And that would essentially be the equivalent of almost 2 floors, full floors of this development. It's a larger requirement. Is that what you?
I just wondered what the difference is. Like if you took the per dwelling unit, what does that square out to in per bedroom?
Oh, I understand. I don't have those figures. I'm hoping maybe Trevor will when he comes up. But my understanding, based on reading the information they have submitted, was that essentially the 25 square meters per dwelling unit would be essentially 2 floors. So it would be over 1,000 square meters, if that helps. I don't have a calculator, sorry.
Seeing that there are no more questions from council, I will now ask any registered delegations to come forward, and that would be Mr. Trevor Hawkins, I believe. Welcome, Mr. Hawkins, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Chair Veith, Mayor Jaworski, members of council, new members of council. Ms. Zelak has done an excellent job of summarizing the application, but I'm going to touch on a few points. Here with me this evening is also Dan Curry from MHBC, and Dan led the Heritage Impact Assessment and dealt with that matter with the Heritage Committee. Gord Harrison from the credit union, the owner of the property, and Patrick Simmons, who's the architect that's designed this wonderful building. Rita did show us some pictures, but I just wanted to walk through a little bit more of the context of the area. So standing on King Street here, just beside the Heritage Green, we look south, we see the Bauer development, the Circa project that Rita noted was under construction, the funeral home next door, and then in the background on the left of the image is the Allen Square 7-story office building. We can see that building much more clearly here. It's almost right across the street. There's a law office across the street with a surface parking lot right across from this property. And the parking structure associated with the Allen Square actually does wrap around and fronts onto George Street as well. It's an elevated structure. We can partially see it in this location here. There's a church and a 4-story apartment building further along George Street. And this is the corner of the credit union property. The surface parking lot that already exists at 164 King Street South. The building at 8 George Street that would be demolished as part of this project. And then standing right outside the credit union main entrance on King Street, again looking south. Essentially the main element of the official plan amendment, as Rita noted, was to bring 8 George Street into the same land use framework as 164 and 168. This will allow for the coordinated development of the lands. Brings it all under the same rules, the same regulations. In this case, the other 2 properties are already designated for 12 stories or 40 meters, medium-high designation, and uptown mixed use in terms of land use. The difference that we are seeking for 8 George Street is to apply a special provision area, a special policy, if you will, for just that part of the property to lower its permitted height to 6 stories or 20 meters. And this way, the city's sort of height and density land use framework is set up to go from high to medium, and then into low. In this part of Uptown, as it exists today, we have 168 King Street, which is medium high, 40 meters, and then right next to it, 8 George Street, which is also owned by the credit union, is actually low. So it goes from medium high down to low today. We're proposing to insert a bit more of a transition to go from medium high to medium and then low as you go towards 10 George Street and further to the east. So that is essentially the essence of the official plan amendment component of the project. The development itself is actually by and large an 8-story building. So up to this point here, it's 8 floors. There's 2 floors of commercial, 6 floors of residential, and then there's this smaller indoor amenity space on the rooftop. So the rooftop is solely devoted to amenity space, both indoor and, as you can see, outdoor as well. The first 2 floors, which are shown in the image in the bottom left, the main floor would be effectively the credit union replaced in its current location in a new building. And then the second floor would be office space associated with a different component of the credit union's operation. So they would move some of their employment office space from another location in Waterloo region to this building, and it would occupy the entirety of the second floor. Access, as Rita noted, is from Kuntz Lane in 2 locations because of the irregular shape of the parcel, and then an entrance onto George Street so you can get to King Street. There is pedestrian access to the commercial component of the project right at the corner of Kuntz Lane and King Street, and there is the main pedestrian entrance to the residential side of the project is from George Street, which is a little more residential in character. This site plan actually shows how the second floor of the building cantilevers over the parking at grade. So unfortunately, or fortunately for our drinking water, we can't actually go underground on this site because the region won't allow it because of the proximity of the wells on William Street across from where we're standing today. So as a result, we either had to put all the parking above grade in a structure or make use of the surface parking. So this is why you don't see a typical underground parking garage entrance and why you see more surface parking than you might normally see in an infill project like this. So we were unable to accommodate that parking underground in this scenario, and because of the irregular shape of the parcel, it's difficult to create ramping in an internal structure without bringing that structure all the way over, so it's very close to 10 George Street. So we've tried to balance a number of objectives here, obviously respecting the region's wishes with underground parking, but also bringing the building as far away from 10 George Street, the lot line shown dashed here, as we could. So we're exceeding the low-rise residential setback that would apply in the old bylaw and the new bylaw because the building has been pushed so far away. But as a result of that, we see more surface parking than perhaps council's used to in other projects. In terms of design, we've made a conscious effort, and Mr. Simmons has made a conscious effort in his design of the building to address the street. So we look at this, obviously the King Street side with the tracks. We have main floor activity all the way across because it's the credit union where people will be coming and going and visiting and doing their banking. Again, it wraps all the way around the corner. So this image shows, it starts to come around the corner, and then this image shows the facade facing the Heritage Green Park. So we haven't ignored the park either. We've created active spaces across from the park. And then the entrance to George Street we can just see in this image, and it's, later on we can see in the rendering. So the entrance for residents who go to their units would come in from George Street. So in the space we have, we've tried to address all three streets with creating active uses at grade, and then through the use of building materials we've created a strong base to this 8-story building, and then through the use of an enclosed amenity space created a bit of a roof line to create some interest in the longer views of the building. Rita's kind of gone through this, and again, the main effort we made when going from the C2 zone, which is an older zone with older regulations, we've tried to bring this project and bridge the gap between the C2 zone and the U2 zone. Council's approved new zoning bylaws. So you'll see the residential parking rate, the setbacks from King Street. We wanted to bring it to 4 meters, figuring that all the other new buildings that are built along the side of King Street would have a 4-meter setback, so we might as well design our building to meet with that new streetscape. The landscape, again, the surface parking is around 1.5 to 2 meters in terms of landscape buffer next to 10 George Street. So we can't meet the average, but we're at or above the minimum in the bylaw. We've suggested a 500 bedroom per hectare density. The project is well below that, but the two U2 zone equivalents, U230, U240, are 525 and 600. In terms of commercial parking, we're 3 spaces short of the U2 zone requirement. So that's why it's 1.23 spaces per 100 as opposed to 1.5. It equates on the ground to 3 spaces, but we meet the residential and visitor parking rates. As Rita alluded to, we submitted a number of studies. I just wanted to touch on the shadow study. We talked a little bit about the heritage study as well. The shadow study, we looked at how the shadows from this building would impact the park, as well as surrounding residential properties. The shadow impacts from this building exceed the requirements in the city's urban design manual. It actually moves fairly quickly across the park during the spring and summer and fall. And then the impacts on 10 George Street, which is the only residential property that has any shadow impacts, are quite minimal. They're almost non-existent in the summer. And there are some late afternoon shadow impacts in the spring and fall. We touched a little bit on the heritage impact assessment, so it's been submitted. It dealt with the listed property at 168. It's been heard and supported by the committee. The building has been modified quite significantly from its original. It was what you see on the street today is significantly larger than what the actual old building was, and it's been modified so many times over the years in the heritage impact assessment, which is on the city's website. If council wishes to read it in detail, goes through quite a bit of the details of the history of the property. And again, that matter has been heard by the Heritage Committee. In conclusion, we think this is a terrific addition to the Uptown. We're excited that it will add a good mix of uses. So the service commercial orientation with the credit union, an employment component, and then a residential component. So really 3 separate components. We think the unit mix, which will be a good mix of 2 and 1 bedroom units, will serve the community and offer a good choice for those wishing to live in proximity to Uptown. We think the building's been designed to address the pedestrian scale on all 3 facades. And again, it's located in a terrific place, a terrific corner in Uptown. And we think that this building, with the proximity to the park, has an opportunity to be an exciting place to live. Thank you, Chair Veith. Happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. Are there any questions for the planner? Yes. Councillor Bonagor.
Through you, Chair Veith. Thank you for bringing this in today. As the Ward 7 councillor, I am very curious about it. So I've got a few questions, if that's okay. I mean, as you pointed out, this is a transition zone. You're facing a lot of different kind of buildings. You've got residential right behind you. So I'm just curious as to how you see this fitting into the neighborhood mix around it.
I think I've got a good slide here. Hopefully that will help us. So I think through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Bonagor, I think that you've alluded to the mix in the neighborhood, and that's exactly true. There is quite a mix in this neighborhood. We have a park, we have office, commercial uses, we have a public facility with pumping station, we have a spiritual use, we have an existing 4-story apartment building further down the street, we have a large office building that wraps around, so there's already quite a broad mix of uses in this location. It isn't a street dominated by one particular built form or one particular use. What we've tried to do is create a modern building that will add something new and exciting to the area. We've oriented the building close to King Street, as I alluded to earlier, to make it further away from the nearest really low-rise residential property at 10 George. So we were definitely cognizant when we were designing the site that this was going to be the most sensitive interface when we were looking at redeveloping the lands. So as a result, we haven't put any buildings in behind them. It's just parking, which can be buffered with landscaping and screening. And again, along their other property is landscaping and fencing to mask parking. And then the building is pushed way closer to King Street. So that was all purposely done to really speak to the most sensitive interface.
And given that this is really an entryway into one of our prime uptown neighbourhoods, can you explain to me the reasons to essentially halve the landscaped buffer?
Well, certainly, Councillor V, through you to Councillor Bonagor, the landscape buffer, so the intent of that landscape buffer, so there's two components to the low-rise setback. There's the physical separation, and then there's the second component, which is the landscape buffer. So you're intended to provide an average of 3 meters, so you can waiver that separation, but in no cases less than 1.5 meters. And because we had to use surface parking as our solution to a lot of the other components that I talked about earlier, we had limited space when you're laying out the parking lot and wanting to push the building closer to King Street. So we're able to provide between 1.5 and a little over 2 meters of landscape separation along that one side, and really that's the only side it would apply to.
Okay. And I'm just curious overall, can you tell me, can you give me some idea of what the timeline is for this project and whether you're planning to hold additional public information sessions on top of what's purely required?
Again, through you, Chair Veith. So the application was submitted, I believe, back in August or maybe September. Anyway, it was submitted quite a long time ago, but because of the election, we had to wait for the informal public meeting. So I think the owner is certainly excited to move forward. They're ready to engage with council and the community. If there's interest from the community in holding another session, we'd be certainly happy to do so and help clarify any aspects of the project that they have questions about.
Thank you. I've got no other questions.
Thank you. Good questions. Mayor Jaworski.
Thank you. Through the chair to Trevor. Regarding parking and the commercial parking, I think you mentioned that all in all, the site would be 3 short on the commercial parking requirements. And you also mentioned earlier that it sounds like the applicant plans to move back in. YNCU plans to move back in to occupy the space. And I didn't hear how many parking spots for commercial use will be created, and I'm just wondering if comparing that to what is available today, what is in need today, taking into account employees and customers going in and out.
Very good question, Mayor Jaworski. So the credit union has been operating in that location for a long time. They're certainly well aware of their customer needs and are able to manage their employee needs in terms of parking. There'll be 10 spaces devoted solely to the commercial use. In terms of the customer use, there'll be more than enough parking to serve the customer use. There's an expectation that the credit union will manage their employees' parking if the employees are not making use of all the other ways to get to this property, transit, cycling, the Spurline Trail, the Iron Horse Trail are so close by as well. Then they will have to make arrangements to find parking in other locations. And one of the great things about this location, of course, is the city offers many permit parking spaces in this area, and so that's obviously a last resort option if the employee doesn't find another way to get there. What we were looking at was the ARC site down the street was a similar employment-based use, and the new bylaw has a lower parking rate for that site than what we're contemplating for this site. So we felt they were very similar in characteristics, and that the combination of the location of this site plus the ARC site and the ability for the credit union, who's going to be a known commodity, long history on this in this area, and well versed in how to manage their own parking needs. I think they're very confident that they can do that.
And you also brought up active transportation. If I recall, YNCU was one of the first sites in Uptown to embrace community bike share. I forget the CAB, I can't remember what the A stands for, but bike share. But how might all modes of transportation, bike lockers, what might be available at this facility taking into account commercial and residential?
Again, through you, Chair Vieth, to Mayor Jaworski, one of the other aspects of our request was to use the city's new bike parking regulations in the new bylaw and bring it forward for this property. So we're intending to provide the equivalent parking requirements, 0.6 spaces per unit for residents, and then the percentage requirement associated with the commercial. Normally, of course, if you had an underground parking structure, you'd put a lot of that parking underground. In this case, we're going to have to be more creative and use bike lockers as well as public locations to park bikes.
Anyone else? Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Chair Vieth, and thank you, Trevor, for coming in. Lots of conversation has touched on the questions I had coming in. There was only one that I think was left by others that Rita had raised in her presentation, and that was the draft Uptown Public Realm strategy and the desire for connecting the regional well facility and the Heritage Green, looking specifically at the land that you slated for parking. Can you comment on your appetite for engaging in that staff request as we go forward through the next phases? I did take a look at your grading plan, and it does seem challenging with what you currently have presented. So I'm curious on that.
Through you, Chair Vieth, to Councillor Henry, thank you for reviewing that grading plan in detail. You're absolutely correct. For those who aren't aware exactly where Rita was referring to, so that the idea was to create a connection from the Heritage Green through the 164 King Street South part of the property to the pumping station in the back here. We have had conversations already with Ms. Seelock and Mr. Cotter about accommodating that pathway. The credit union is certainly amenable to an arrangement. They obviously do, because the region doesn't want all the stormwater draining towards their property, we have had to raise the back of the property. It actually slopes from the front here to the back about a meter and a little bit. So the region really wanted us to have it drain out towards the storm sewer on George Street. That's why that retaining wall in that property's been raised. But we're certainly going to engage with our engineering firm to figure out a way to accommodate that.
Councillor Freeman.
I was just looking at the renderings and the urban design brief, and I just was trying to understand. So in the new comprehensive zoning bylaw, is there requirements for step backs for the podium?
There, through you, Chair Vieth, to Councillor Freeman, the new bylaw would require a step back for a building over 6 stories. So yes, for this would be, I believe, above the 4th floor, roughly 3rd or 4th floor.
So I guess how have you addressed that in this plan?
Well, I think we submitted, obviously, before the new bylaw, so we submitted under the C2 zoning, which doesn't have a step back. However, I think we're of the opinion that there are lots of different ways you can create buildings that address the street and activate the street and create a pedestrian scale. There is a step back on the Kuntz Lane side, which would be the more publicly active component of given the King Street plus the park. The building itself has a strong base element through materials. There's a clear definition between the first 2 floors, which are commercial, and the residential above. There's canopy treatments along the main floor, which clearly identify the entrance here from George Street, the main entrance that wraps around onto Coons Lane on King Street. So we've used a number of techniques to anchor the building to the pedestrian scale and then differentiate the residential component above. And then we've recessed, again, the 8th, going to the 9th floor with the amenity space. And we've created some projections and recessions along the George Street side to add visual interest as you're driving up King Street. So used a number of techniques to create what we think is a very nice looking building.
So, a couple of questions. Recognizing that you're seeking a bit of a parking reduction, and you're also shifting from the old C2 zoning to the new zoning, which is substantially less parking. How have the entrances to the residential areas been modified to facilitate use of a bicycle, for example, as a primary mode of transportation? Because this looks like a fairly small entrance.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Freeman, I think because of the limited ability to create underground personal storage areas where you would perhaps store your bike if you were a cyclist and living in the building, we're going to have to explore secure outdoor bike parking locations. So we've already started to look at where we could put those, because otherwise we'd be looking at using the 9th floor, and we don't want cyclists to carry their bikes all the way up to the 9th floor. So unfortunately, we can't use a traditional indoor bike storage location. We're going to have to be a little bit more inventive in creating secure outdoor bike spaces.
So will that result in reduced parking?
So the new zoning bylaw allows Type A and Type B parking, bike parking, and I can't remember which one is which, but the one that's secure and indoor can be secure or indoor. So it can be either indoor or it can be outdoor and secure, and we would pursue outdoor and secure.
And my last question is with regard to the pedestrian realm. I was pretty sure that when the red came to this council for consideration, we had a long discussion about installation of trees and creating a tree canopy along the King Street frontage. How will you carry along that frontage here?
Through you, Chair Veith, so the building has 4 meters along King Street from building face to property line and 5 on George Street. So there's lots of space in which we can do some landscaping in this location, and there's no underground structures underneath to impede root growth. So there should be opportunities to do quite a bit of landscaping in this area. We haven't refined the landscaping plan to that degree, but there's space and ability to do so.
Councillor Bassick.
Through you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I have just a couple of questions. You mentioned that it went through Heritage. You brought it to Heritage. I'm just curious what feedback they gave.
I'm going to refer to Mr. Curry, who actually did the study and went to the committee.
Thanks. Dan Curry, I'm HPC Planning, through you, Councillor Veith. The Heritage Impact Assessment went to the Heritage Committee, I believe, in November. And the issue, what the Heritage Impact Assessment really looked at was the building had been listed on the Heritage Registry with the thought that it was one of the oldest apartment buildings in Waterloo. So the work we did as part of the research to that Heritage Impact Assessment identified that it's not. There's actually 7 or 8 buildings that are older, apartment buildings that are older than this. And so in answer to your question, the Heritage Committee approved the Heritage Impact Assessment. So they ultimately approved the demolition of the listed building, recognizing that the research that was undertaken confirmed that it didn't have the heritage value that was thought at the time when it was put on the listing.
And then my other question is just around, I guess I'm learning about these development applications. And there's so many factors you have to consider and fall within regulations and bylaws. So I guess I'm hearing a lot of, well, we did this, we did this, we did this, because we have to. Totally cool. And then you started talking a little bit about, well, we did this because it added a little bit of interest. So I guess I'm really curious, what are some of those new and modern things that, like, when you're at the office and you're talking about things you're really jazzed about with this new development? And I know Rita said also that there are things you're considering to add value. And so as somebody who lives in Waterloo and who loves it here and wants people who live here to feel jazzed about living here, like, I also want the developers and architects to feel really jazzed. So I'm just curious what you get excited about at the office when you're talking about this building, and if you could share that with everybody.
Through you, Chair Veith, I have to do an awful lot of work with Mr. Cotter, so I'm not gonna delve too far into details. We like to work and agree with a vision that staff have. So very often you'll find that a project starts here and staff start here, and then eventually the project meets in the middle where staff are happy that it's got to and the developer's happy that it's got to. We've already had a few discussions with staff. We have a general sense of where they would like to see things go. I think we've tried to respect some of the new regulations in the zoning bylaw, recognizing that it's so new. There's lots of things that, if some of those rules weren't in place, we could pursue, particularly on the lower floors of buildings, and particularly if underground parking were allowed. I think some relaxation in rules and setbacks for underground parking would allow for a lot more creativity above ground. So perhaps you can file that one away. But the ability to accentuate buildings, project buildings, reduce setbacks for creative new approaches to design. So previous councils seen some exciting buildings from a lot of different developers where they've had to ask for relaxation in the rules, and sometimes those relaxations are the right thing to do from council and staff's perspective and the developer's perspective, because it creates something that everyone can be excited about. So we always get excited about projects, and some of them we get super excited about, and I think this one is a really great location because it has so many attributes right around it within walking distance. And we're also excited about offering sort of a smaller building footprint, really an 8-story building with a little bit of a 9th floor, when the area has seen a lot of buildings that are 20 or more stories. So it's a different type of apartment building that residents who don't want to live in a high-rise tower can still live in sort of a condominium environment without living in such a tall building. They can feel closer to the street. So, yeah.
Councillor Bonagor has another question. Go ahead.
Sorry, I have one last question. Are there any aspects of, like, sustainable building design that have been factored into this that we should know about?
Well, I think we've had to be very cognizant of how we manage our stormwater on this property because of the proximity of the well and the groundwater. So there are going to be a lot of unusual engineering approaches to manage stormwater, even in terms of the physical construction of the pipes that collect the stormwater underground. They're going to be a little bit more advanced, and the rooftop collections are going to be quite significant. Mr. Kaminsky probably didn't allude to it in his business plan presentation, but the building code's advanced significantly in the last number of years, such that really you're looking at a LEED silver building when you're just meeting the building code. So buildings are becoming so energy efficient now just by meeting the minimum rules. But this building is going to have higher quality finishes, higher quality materials in terms of its construction, which will lead to energy efficiencies.
Okay. Councillor Vasek, one more question.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Your question made me think of another question. Around public art, are there any, because like you said, it's kind of a gateway into the uptown, into this node. Are there any plans for public art?
I think our public contribution will be focused around creating an exciting pathway connection between the Heritage Green and the pumping station. So we'll be looking at how to make that an inviting space for the public to use.
Awesome. Okay, I think you're done there for a few minutes. We have one more registered delegation, Brooke Thiessen. He's not here. Okay, then. Is there anyone else here tonight that wishes to speak to this application? Okay, then. No one. Are there any, if there's no more delegations, then this informal public meeting is now concluded. Staff will review the issues and provide further reporting to council at a later date. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so we're on to the next informal public meeting. This is an informal public meeting to consider item 7B, official plan zone change number 24 and zoning amendment application Z18-17 and draft plan subdivision 30T-18401, 928, 960, 980 Herb Street West, and 100 the Wilmot line. There would be no decisions made tonight. Council and the public are seeing this application for the first time. Council is looking for feedback from interested parties with respect to this application. Tonight's comments will be taken into consideration in developing a staff position on this application, and a staff report will be considered by council during a formal public meeting at a future meeting. All property owners within 120 meters of the subject land and anyone who signs the registry will receive notice of the formal public meeting. Anybody who wants further notice of this application, including the formal public meeting and passage of any bylaw, should sign the appropriate registry located on the desk at the rear of council chambers. If there is more than one registry, please make sure that you are signing the appropriate one. The planner, Natalie Hardacre, will now provide a brief overview of the application. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Veith, Mayor Jaworski, members of council. As noted, this is an informal public meeting for what we refer to as the West Side Employment Lands. And with that development, 3 applications have been submitted to the city. One is for official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, and a draft plan of subdivision. And the property is municipally known as 928, 960, 980 Herb Street West, and 100 the Wilmot line. The applicant in this instance is the City of Waterloo. So to orient council, the property is identified within this red line. The property is located directly west of the hydro corridor. It is south of Columbia Street West and the Vista Hills subdivision to the north. It is directly east of the Wilmot line, which is a township road, and it actually forms the boundary between the township of Wilmot and the city of Waterloo. It is located directly north of the region's waste management site and Herb Street West. It's also located north and west of the Costco site, Platinum Drive, which is existing in this location, and Copper Street, which is directly behind the Costco building. The property is made up of all of these lands here, but it actually does not include this portion, which is privately owned and identified as 50 the Wilmot line, as well as a corner property, which is located at the corner of Wilmot line and Herb Street, which is under the region's ownership and has a water reservoir there, and it's identified as 990 Herb Street. The property currently, or was rather, the location of a golf course, the Waterloo Golf Academy. It was also the Hergot Cider Mill, which operated up until about 2010 and was in that ownership for many, many years. It also has a temporary stormwater management pond located in this location here along the hydro corridor. Oh, and one thing to note is in this location, just north of Platinum Drive, there is a ruins of a blacksmith and smoke shop, which was from the original Hergot farmstead. The city's official plan and zoning bylaw, or specifically the official plan, designates the property business employment. So the entirety of the property, with the exception of a small piece here that's shown in green, and a portion of a green blob, I'll call it, borders the property here, which is designated open space lands. So the balance, being the gray area, is designated business employment. It's also subject to specific provision area 43, and in our official plan, specific provision areas are specific rules for specific properties within the official plan. So in this particular instance, SPA 43 speaks to a convenience commercial property located in this general direction that has the ability to relocate along Columbia Street, subject to certain criteria in the official plan. And it is identified for medium density development with a height of no greater than 27 meters, building height no greater than 27 meters. So 2 zoning bylaws are being looked at through this application, and I know Rita in the previous presentation spoke to the new zoning bylaw versus the previous zoning bylaw. And in this instance, zoning bylaw 1418 does apply, which zones the property agriculture. The new zoning bylaw, which is zoning bylaw 2018-050, zones the property zone change application, or ZC. And what that means is that the application was submitted to planning approvals prior to the new zoning bylaw coming into place. So it recognizes that an active zoning application applies to the property at the time the zoning bylaw was approved by council. And as I'm sure you're aware, that zoning bylaw is currently under appeal. So with this submission, the applicant submitted a draft plan of subdivision, and I know you heard from Mr. Cotter earlier that draft plans of subdivision, although they're submitted to us for review and consideration with the zone change applications and official plan amendments, that draft plans of subdivision are the approval authority, the region has the approval authority over draft plans of subdivision. So we will be providing comments to the region for their approval, if that's how that ends up. But we will be reviewing the zone change application and the official plan amendment in connection with comments in relation to the draft plan of subdivision. So the proposal by the applicant shows the extension of Platinum Drive, and just to orient, this is the hydro corridor here, the Vista Hills subdivision to the north, and Wilmot Line here and Herb Street here with the 2 roundabouts and the Costco site in this location. The proposal intends to extend Platinum Drive into the subdivision and connect up to Columbia Street in the location of Lady Slipper Drive. It is intended that a roundabout, or proposed that a roundabout be at that particular intersection, as well as 2 internal roundabouts within the subdivision in this location here at Copper and Platinum, as well as in this location, which would connect to internal streets that would connect to the various blocks that are proposed to be formed through the creation of the draft plan of subdivision. The temporary stormwater management pond is proposed to be removed, and a ultimate stormwater management facility is planned off of Columbia Street in this location within the hydro corridor. It's lands that the city has actually purchased a few years back for that purpose. So this stormwater management facility is intended to service not only the Costco sites, but also the whole of the development, which will render this temporary storm pond no longer required. So ultimately, the purpose of the subdivision is to create a number of blocks for employment purposes. So all of the blocks that are shown without colors, so the white blocks, are all intended for employment. The 2 red blocks, one here and one here at the corner of Lady Slipper and Columbia, and I guess the future Platinum Road extension where it's proposed in this location, are intended for commercial, convenience commercial / employment, so a mixture of both. As well as in this location, a park, walkways that would extend east-west across the site down to Wilmot Line, so connecting the hydro corridor, the park, and down to Wilmot Line. And in this location, a walkway which would be wide enough to also serve as a servicing easement, a servicing connection from the internal streets up to Columbia and the stormwater management pond in that location. So with their application, an official plan amendment was submitted. The purpose of the official plan amendment, and the image in this slide I'll note was submitted by the applicant, being Economic Development, and their consultant Stantec, to explain the request to amend the official plan. The lands that are shown in white and purple are proposed to be or rather this area here, let's take a step back. There's two green circles, one here and one here. Currently, those are the areas that I noted previously in the official plan that are designated open space. Through the official plan amendment, the applicant is requesting that those open space designated areas be designated employment, so that the entirety of the site would be employment. They're also looking at, the request is to allow convenience commercial permissions in this area. So uses that align more with the convenience commercial nature than an employment nature to provide some commercial blocks in this location, as I previously mentioned. The applicant is also requesting traditional and industrial permissions on all lands that are shown in purple. You'll note that the two areas more in proximity to Columbia Street, they are not requesting those traditional type employment uses in that area, given its proximity to the residential subdivision to the north. The applicant is also looking for, and has requested through their application, additional uses along Platinum Drive. And these uses that they've requested are more commercial service type uses and personal service uses. And that would be within that hatched area shown here, north of, or I guess rather east of Platinum Drive and west of Platinum Drive along this corridor. The zone change application, or the zone change amendment application that was submitted with the by the applicant, proposes to rezone the property business employment. So from the previous agricultural zone or ZC zone, depending on which zoning bylaw you're looking at, to business employment. So EI 27, and the 27 would represent a height restriction, so the maximum height permitted of 27 meters. And that would be in the location that's shown in yellow and purple. And again, this is an image submitted by the applicant to explain the request that they put forward to city staff. The convenience commercial is shown in red, parks and recreation in green, and some site specifics that would allow, again, those personal service and specific uses along the corridor that they've shown as the extension of Platinum Drive, and some restricted uses in this location, which would, given its proximity to the landfill site, would restrict specific uses such as a child care center, for example. So ultimately, the zone change you'll see reflects a lot, or looks a lot like the official plan amendment, and that's exactly what it is. It's specifically implementing, it's requesting that the official plan amendment that they're seeking be implemented at a zone change level. With their application, a number of supporting documents and studies were submitted. This included planning justification reports, of course, the draft plan and subdivision, and a number of other studies. In addition to this list that I've shown here, they are also undertaking archaeological assessments on the property currently. And I'll point out the commemoration assessment brief. This was a study that was requested by staff to review, our heritage planner, to review the existing, any possible opportunities for commemoration of the history of the site with the Hergot cider mill and the ruins on the property that are still existing today, and whether or not those stones or materials can be repurposed in some form through the redevelopment of the site. So moving forward, the next steps, as Mr. Cotter suggested or provided earlier, typically after the informal public meeting, we take all information, we review information that we've received both before and after the informal public meeting, gather the information, review the studies further, have constant dialogue with the applicants about the proposal. So we will be looking at public and agency comments. In addition, we'll take a further review of the requested amendments to the official plan and zoning bylaw. So for example, the proposed land uses and the site-specific policies and regulations that they've requested through the applications, as well as the subdivision design. So for example, context, land use compatibility given the different uses that surround the property, road network and pedestrian connectivity. So the road network that they've proposed at this time, as well as pedestrian connections, park. So for example, its location, its size, its future use, heritage, open space, and other matters as it relates to the design and layout of the subdivision overall. Any traffic calming measures that may be implemented through the design. And then, of course, any other items or issues that might come up through the review of the applications. So at this point, this concludes my presentation, but of course, if there's any questions of council, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Natalie. Are there any questions from councillors? Councillor Bodley.
Through your chair, Veith. Thank you for the presentation. Very informative. I think, speaking on behalf of residents in the area, the thing that has people most jazzed, to steal a term from my colleague, is the extension of Platinum Drive out to Lady Slipper. And I would like to get some information with respect to the timing of the build out of that road in comparison to the rest of the West Side employment lands, what priority it's taking. And I say this noting that currently in the Vista Hills neighborhood, there is only one exit from the neighborhood out Columbia Street to Herbsville Road, which is causing significant issues for residents in the area. And also we are seeing residents utilizing St. Moritz as a road that I don't think it was intended to be utilized for, which is causing some issues for people in the Clare Hills neighborhood, particularly those near the Edna Stabler School. So I'd like some feedback on timing and priority of the Platinum Drive extension, please.
Through you, Chair Veith, timing is a great question with this application. I'll just go back here so we can take a look at the drawings. The creation of a draft plan of subdivision creates the streets themselves and creates the blocks. So for any developer, whether it's a city or any developer at all, in order to move forward with the construction of a road, the parcel of land needs to be created, or there needs to be some mechanism in order to create the street itself and to go through the approval process to ensure that conditions are set out for the appropriate construction of that road. So we are, in essence, going through that process right now. As I said, the region is the approval authority of the subdivision, but we are the approval authority, council is the approval authority for the zone change, and we will be dovetailing and have been dovetailing these processes concurrently to ensure streamlining the process and ensure that all the matters are addressed and resolved and reviewed concurrently. So from a timing perspective, construction of the road can't actually begin until some of these approvals are in place. For example, draft approval of the subdivision, and then of course there will be a set of conditions that we will provide to the region for the construction, the appropriate construction of the road, services, and so on. So at grade and underground. That being said, there are mechanisms in place that grading, there are mechanisms where grading can occur prior to formal approvals. The applicant in this instance may be seeking having grading on the site occur earlier than later, given the tight timelines. Understanding that the plan for Platinum Drive to extend up to Columbia has been in the works for some time. The configuration of such needs to be, of course, reviewed through an appropriate planning process, and approvals need to be granted through an appropriate planning process as well. So I don't know if that's directly answered your question. I can't give you an exact timeline, but I know that it's something that the applicant is looking to move forward sooner rather than later. But of course, there's a process that needs to happen first.
I appreciate that. I would just use this opportunity and platform, I guess, to reiterate some of the feedback that I've received from residents, which is that irrespective of what is happening on this property, vis-a-vis the employment lands, parks, trail system, etc., the Platinum Drive extension has to, in my opinion, and I think it should be the opinion of staff, that this is the #1 priority for this subdivision, and irrespective of what is happening with the rest of the property. So I would hope that staff shares that viewpoint, and as we get further and further down the road, we are, as soon as we are able to legally, I suppose, for lack of a better word, build this road, I would hope that that takes significant priority.
That was a good question. Yes. Councillor Bonagor.
Through you, Chair Feith. I'm just, again, new to this, so we have questions. You mentioned certain kinds of employment on certain parcels of land. Are there provisions to set guidelines or limits on the uses of these industrial lands, given how close it is to the environmentally sensitive landscape?
Through you, Chair Veith, absolutely. So that will be part of a big component of our review internally from planning approvals perspective, is what are the uses that the applicant is requesting, and how will those relate from a land use compatibility perspective. So we do have the hydro corridor on the east, we have an existing residential neighborhood to the north, and on the other side of the hydro corridor to the east, we have agricultural lands on the west, and we have a landfill site to the south. So there really is a lot to consider in the review of this application from a land use compatibility perspective. So taking a look at what's being proposed and where internal to the site will be very paramount in the review of this application to ensure that there are no issues of land use compatibility.
Councillor Bodley, one more question.
Sorry, this is something that just occurred to me. All of the, I guess, access is all of the access for the employment buildings going to be internal? So, for example, will there be any access off of Columbia Street, for example, or I would hope not, the Wilmot line?
Through you, Chair Veith, that's an excellent question. To speak to Columbia Street, it is not intended that any access will be provided, vehicular access will be provided from Columbia Street to any of the internal employment blocks. So in particular, this block here, which of course has frontage both on Columbia and this internal street here, it is intended that the vehicular access to that block, or blocks as the case might be, if that is further subdivided, would be off of this internal street, and the same in this location. The Wilmot line was the second part of your question. The township has vocalized many times in the development of the Vista Hill subdivision that they do not want any access to the Wilmot line. So in particular, this has been designed to ensure access to these employment blocks from these internal streets, no different than in the area of Columbia Street.
Comment from Mr. Rapp first, and then Councillor Bassett.
Certainly, just to inform council, just to augment a little bit of what Natalie had said. To be clear, the privately owned parcel that is not part of the draft plan application does have access to the Wilmot line, and they will be able to maintain that access. The draft plan has been designed away with Street C that ultimately they could close the access to the Wilmot line and access through to Street C. But until that parcel is developed and we have the ability to provide access to Street C, they will be able to maintain and develop that parcel with existing permissions with the access to the Wilmot line. I just wanted to clarify that for members of the public as well as for council.
Thank you. Councillor Bassett.
Thanks. Through you, Chair Feith. How do streets get named? I know these are silly questions kind of, but I've had people ask like, oh, if there are opportunities in new subdivisions to name streets, how could we do that in a really meaningful way? So here it is, and that question was just asked of me. So I'm really curious how streets are named.
So through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Bassett, that's an excellent question as well. Typically, it's streets are named because developers put them forward as potential names. I do believe there is a process in which it needs to be vetted through for safety reasons from the fire department to ensure that we don't have a name that's similar sounding to another street in the case of an emergency. But ultimately, I think there's no major magic other than developers typically bring them forward as suggested names.
Thank you. Mr. Cotter, did you have a comment on that?
Through your chair, Veith, just to further Natalie's comments. Street names are often determined through the district planning process, where through the district plans, we identify areas or themed areas. So for example, in Ward 3, you've got Blue Nose and those types of Atlantic themes going on. In Ward 4, Ward 5, you've got equestrian-related themes. In this area, these Platinum Drive and Copper Street were actually named after precious metals related to tech. However, this is a process whereby these street names could be changed through the economic development component of this conversation. That the streets, currently there's no properties. Costco and the related lands have addresses to Herb Street. So should council wish to rename these streets for economic development purposes, they could easily do that. But for now, we've named them after precious metals related to high-tech industries.
Thank you very much for that clarification and for that great question, Councillor Vossick. Are there any more questions from council? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to welcome Mr. Romanek to the podium. Happy New Year, sir.
Thank you. Happy New Year. Lissy, I need you. Oh, there we go. Oh, it went. Good. Yeah, thank you. Good evening. My name is Greg Romanek. I'm a planner with Stantec Consulting Limited. With me this evening is Sandy Little from the city's Economic Development Office, representing the city of Waterloo as the applicant. I also acknowledge that the city's Economic Development Office has been our key contact into the city, so we've worked very closely with Sandy and also Justin McFadden. Also with me this evening are several of our consultant team colleagues from Stantec and from Urban Metrics who did the market analysis for this proposal. These individuals will introduce themselves a little later if and as they respond to questions. Stantec, along with our partner consultant firms, were retained in 2017 by the city to study and then develop a land use proposal and a subdivision design for these West Side employment lands. The consultant team, on behalf of the applicant landowner, the city, has followed the same planning review process as any other private sector applicant, landowner, developer would. We attended a pre-consultation meeting on January 3rd, 2018. From that meeting, city and regional staff, with input from commenting agencies such as GRCA, set out all of the requirements that we would have to fulfill, such as what studies we would have to do in order to submit a complete application or applications. With this direction, the consultant team prepared a complete official plan and zoning bylaw amendment application and a draft plan of subdivision application, which are before you this evening. These applications were submitted last summer on August 24th to the city and the region. This diagram, like the one that Natalie used in her presentation, outlines or highlights the area under our proposal and our applications. And I think Natalie did an excellent job in describing the surrounding land uses, the context. So I might just go quickly through here and I'll come back if we need to. In preparing and submitting our complete application package, a very broad-based assessment approach was taken. We undertook over 15 detailed background studies. These were used to inform and shape our applications. These studies included, but are not just exhaustive of these that are listed here. These are some of the more perhaps noteworthy ones: the market analysis, a transportation impact study. There were actually several components of environmental study undertaken. Detailed engineering servicing work was done. a land use compatibility assessment to understand the relationships of land uses in the subject area relative to the regional landfill site to the south across Herb Street. We've also undertaken several stages of archaeological study, and we continue to work on that today. And as noted earlier by Natalie, we've looked at the historic elements of the property and the idea of recognizing the former Herget homestead, farmstead, and the cider mill elements. Lastly, we tried to pull all of this barrage of stuff, planning study or different studies, into kind of an overall planning assessment, taking all of this into account and doing an evaluation and trying to justify the proposals that are put forward to you this evening. In the next few slides, I'm just going to provide some key highlights from just a few of the key studies undertaken. There's so much that went on here, it would be impossible to get through this in a short time. But firstly, and noteworthy, was the market analysis undertaken by Urban Metrics. This was very key in shaping the proposed official plan amendments and the zoning bylaw amendments that we're proposing. The market analysis notes that there's currently a very significant surplus of existing floor space and lands within other central areas of the city and other suburban areas to accommodate high-tech office uses. Rather than office space, there is, and there will continue to be, a need for lands that may incorporate high-tech office components, but also require flexible space to accommodate startup and second-generation technology uses. By flexible space, this idea includes the ability to have office, to do research and development, but also to undertake advanced manufacturing, processing, assembly, to include labs, and also storage and warehouse space, all under one roof. The land use proposals in our applications would provide for this type of flexible space, but does maintain the focus on an office type of environment along Columbia Street, adjacent to the residential lands to the north. The proposed subdivision incorporates large, lotless blocks, the idea being that the city, when it's marketing and selling lands to various users, would be able to take these larger blocks and cut them down into smaller pieces to actually meet the actual size requirements of any particular use. This is a practice that has been used quite a bit by the city in the past in other areas of the city in the delivery of city marketed employment lands. As I noted, in the area of the environment, we undertook a number of areas of study. There was a phase 1, phase 2 environmental site assessment to look at any potential contamination on the site. There is an environmental impact assessment which looks at, for one, those two areas designated open space, as well as other environmentally noteworthy lands. There was also a hydrogeological study done and a geotechnical evaluation of subsurface features and characteristics. Also a general vegetation assessment looking at trees and other vegetation. The key conclusions when you look at all of these environmental studies is that, in our opinion, the proposed land use and subdivision design are appropriate, can be implemented here, and that through the usual management and design techniques that we use in delivering these kinds of employment areas, the environmental issues can be dealt with and addressed and managed. The transportation impact study we undertook came to several key conclusions, and I'm listing just a few here. First off, the increased traffic within, into, and out of the subject lands can be managed. Certain design improvements to the existing system and along with elements added into the new subdivision elements will need to be improved in this area. One of the key improvements realized, however, is the extension of Platinum Drive from the existing leg adjacent to Costco north to Columbia. This is seen as kind of one of the fundamental improvements in the area from a transportation point of view for this southwest corner of Waterloo. The transportation system and the subdivision design incorporates a number of elements related to active transportation and transit-oriented design. Lastly, as noted earlier, and I'll just reiterate, there is no vehicular access plan to Wilmot Line. We have addressed and studied the historic aspects of this area, the Herget Farmstead, and we are, as I've noted, dealing with archaeological. We've gone through a stage 1 and stage 2 assessment. We're now looking at some localized areas in a much more detailed way through stage 3 assessment. All of this is being done to provincial standard. The first phases are in for their review, and the first stage has actually been approved. So when you draw this down, I mean, in our view, the development of the west side employment lands is timely, and it will bring a number of positive benefits to the city. It will facilitate employment growth generally within the city, and it will provide for employment opportunities. It will provide for an attractive, unique business employment area to meet market needs, and it will provide employment opportunities for people who live in this area of the city. The design is environmentally sound, and it incorporates active transportation transit elements. And finally, it will result in the extension of the new collector road, Platinum Drive, to Columbia Street in its time. So thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Chair and Council for listening. That's the extent of my presentation. I know there might be a lot to go over here, and we have folks here and we're happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from councillors? Okay, thank you. So is there anyone else present who would like to speak to this development? Yes, we have one. Please state your name and your address, Deb.
Good evening, Chair Veith, Mayor Jaworski, councillors, staff, and guests. My name is Deb Sudorovich, and I live on Wilmot Line on the City of Waterloo side. And in fairness to Natalie Hardacre, I just sent an email this morning asking some of my questions. And my concern, as always, is the Laurel Creek environmentally sensitive landscape at the north end of Wilmot Line. On page 10 of 242 of the August 22nd Stantec traffic impact study, the map shows that the intersection of Wilmot Line and Herb Street West is included in the study area. My question is, why is there no discussion about present and projected traffic data for that area in this report, in particular estimated turning movement counts? And I ask that because I see in the report that they refer to the integrated multimodal traffic study and the numbers that they've taken from there for other intersections like Iron Needles, Herbsville Road and Herb Street and other intersections, and have concentrated on mostly the streets that are within the employment lands for their study. But with Wilmot Line situated only a few hundred yards from Platinum Drive, and with a proposed density of 8,000 jobs for the employment lands, there could be a considerable impact on the Laurel Creek ESL to the north from the many delivery vehicles and employees or customers we expect will use this road as a direct, unencumbered connection from or to the Beaver Creek, Laurelwood, Conservation Meadows, Lakeshore North, and Highway 85 areas. And I have to point out this because this has happened to those of us who are concerned about the Laurel Creek ESL and other studies as well. For example, the Beaver Creek Meadows District Plan, when they came out with the traffic projections for that plan, there was nothing for Wilmot Line and Conservation Drive, which was part of that study area. So we had to push to get those numbers there. And then the integrated multimodal traffic analysis. They talked about no connections to Wilmot Line. I believe Phil Hewitson and Cameron Rapp talked about no access points, working with the region on trying to get the upgrades to especially regional roads, coordinated with what the city was doing. And there was some talk about circuitous routes. Well, there's nothing circuitous about traffic that comes from Northfield down Conservation, goes straight to Wilmot Line, down Wilmot Line to Costco. That's not circuitous at all. It doesn't matter if Erbsville Road is expanded, and of course that expansion is not supposed to happen for some time, and I'd like an answer maybe tonight about when they think that might happen. The fact that Platinum Drive was supposed to be put in 2019 is what I heard. And as a matter of fact, we worked years ago to actually buy out the Golf Academy lease so that could be done before the subdivisions were even built. Now, that didn't work out well. We ended up having to give the Golf Academy actually a little bit more time to stay there. And now we're in a position where it's making it very difficult, especially for those emergency accesses. We've had considerable trouble over the last 4 or 5 years trying to stop people from using those accesses to Wilmot Line as arterial roads. So that's my frustration, is that through every report, whether it's the Beaver Creek Meadows District Plan, the Integrated Multimodal Traffic Analysis, or these employment lands, Wilmot Line is assumed that, you know, there isn't going to be an awful lot of traffic from these developments to that line, but each one adds up. And we're well over 1,000 vehicles a day, especially at the north end. And we all know that there's a resolution before council that says once the traffic exceeds 1,000 vehicles a day, steps will be taken to reduce traffic to 1,000 vehicles a day. And so this is, you know, something that I'd like to see corrected in that report, that you include the intersection counts at Wilmot Line and Herb Street, the present and the projected. And if you have to pull them from the integrated multimodal traffic analysis to put them in there, that's fine, but I think they probably need to be done again, and I'm not sure when the region did that intersection count there. But yeah, I guess my concern too, the same as Councillor Badali, is when will Platinum Drive be done? We were told 2019. I'm certainly hoping that that's the case. We would really like to see that done quickly. And that's about it. I really didn't intend to make a presentation tonight, so I don't have anything formally written here, but those are my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deb. Staff have noted that. Are there any questions for the delegation?
Can I say one more thing? I just want to thank Joel Cotter for making his presentation tonight, because earlier today you passed a motion on Bill 66, and it only goes to show you just how much this city goes through to engage the public, and that's such an important thing. So thank you for earlier today on your decision on Bill 66.
Thank you for that. Okay. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak to this? Okay. If there are no more delegations, this informal public meeting is now concluded. Staff will review the issues and provide further reporting to council at a later date. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
It's not quite my first day, but can I use it's my first day?
Yeah. Just tonight, though, then you're done.
Everybody gets one. Through you, Councillor Chair Veith. Could I get some clarification with respect to exactly, perhaps in layman's terms, what traditional industrial means to the residents in the area?
Or Mr. Cotter, please.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Bodley. It's a good question. The specific range of uses, employment uses, can be determined through the zoning that's applied to the property, but traditional industrial would include anything from manufacturing to warehousing to those types of uses. Like, it's mostly manufacturing oriented that you would typically see. There is some integration of office, but most of the office is driven towards our business employment designation, which the majority of the property is currently designated as today. So what I can say is that staff will look at the range of uses and we can provide more clarity through both the staff report, but also in conjunction with the applicant, which is economic development. And as Mr. Romanek indicated, a lot of the decision points to date have been based on the early economic and market work that's been done. So economic development is really trying to stage this development in such a way that it'll be successful both, I think, in the short, medium, and long term, and provide flexibility around range of uses and allowing for adaptability. So we've, through the new zoning bylaw, created a lot of new definitions, and I'm struggling with this because we've created definitions for advanced technology offices that allow for things like laboratories and prototyping, and it's a difficult question to specifically ask, but we can certainly provide more details and make that available to council to help guide you in this conversation.
One more?
Follow up.
Follow up? Go ahead.
Once, if this application is to be approved, will any of the potential tenants be coming back to council for us to have further input on whether or not we would allow a certain type of commercial or traditional industrial use, or once this is approved, anything goes?
Mr. Cotter.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Bodley. It's a good question. In this case, because the city is actually the owner of the lands, it's wearing kind of multiple hats. It's also a hat for the development arm that's before council through this process, but also as the owner of land, you have additional powers. So if council wants to structure future land sales to require kind of further check-ins with council at certain stages, that's within the prerogative of council, working with economic development and legal services to structure any land sale that you believe is in the best interest of the community.
Thank you. Okay, one more informal public meeting tonight. Zoning amendment application Z 18, 19, 36, 42 Herb Street East and 39 DuPont Street, Paramount Development, the Planning Partnership, Bruce Hall. There will be no decisions made tonight. Council and the public are seeing this application for the first time. Council is looking for feedback from interested parties with respect to this application. Tonight's comments will be taken into consideration in developing a staff position on this application, and a staff report will be considered by council during a formal public meeting at a future meeting. All property owners within 120 meters of the subject lands and anyone who signs the registry will receive notice of the formal public meeting. Anyone who wants further notice of this application, including the formal public meeting and passage of any bylaw, should sign the appropriate registry located on the desk at the rear of the council chambers. If there's more than one registry, please make sure you are signing the appropriate one. The planner, Natalie Hardacre, will now present a brief overview of the application. Welcome back.
Good evening again, Chair Veith and Mayor Jaworski, members of council. The application before us for this informal public meeting is a zoning bylaw amendment in Z-18-19. It pertains to 3 properties in the Uptown, 36 and 42 Herb Street East and 39 DuPont Street East. The application was made by Paramount Development Group on behalf of their consultants, the Planning Partnership. The site, to orient council on the location of the site is located directly north of Herb Street East and south of DuPont Street East. It's east of Regina and west of Pepler. It actually has frontage on Herb, Pepler, and DuPont Street. It's formed by 3 properties. The properties consist of as I previously mentioned, 42 Herb Street East, which is the old, we refer to it as the old LCBO site, as well as 39 or 36 rather, Herb Street East, which is the former Buck Animal Hospital, as well as this portion of the site here, which fronts onto DuPont Street and is municipally known as 39 DuPont Street. The site is surrounded by a number of uses, such as medical buildings, low-rise residential. It's also within the uptown core, as I previously mentioned. The property is about less than half an acre in size, so 0.42 hectares in size. It is along or adjacent to the Laurel Trail and the Laurel Creek, which actually comes out of City Hall down here and up through in this location. And given its proximity to the Laurel Trail and the Laurel Creek, the property is within the floodplain. This photograph here shows Herb Street, if you were looking in the easterly direction this way. This is the former LCBO site, and this is the former Buck Animal Hospital. So this is showing, if you were looking on Herb Street across the street, to 36 and 42 Herb Street East. This photograph here is showing 39 DuPont Street, and the other side of 39 Herb Street. So the property that was formerly the Buck Animal Hospital actually has frontage on both Herb Street and DuPont Street. It's a long property that goes between the two streets, so this shows the access in behind in this location. 39 DuPont Street is a listed property on the Municipal Heritage Register as a property of heritage interest. The city's official plan currently designates the property Uptown Commercial Core, and it's within the Uptown Urban Growth Center, which is the city's primary node. It has specific policy areas pertaining to the flood line and the floodway that, of course, need to be reviewed and evaluated through this application, given its proximity to the Laurel Creek. The property contemplates high density and medium density on the property. The property is located in this location. It's hard to see, but there is a black line here. And what this is showing you is two colors on the property. The yellowy orange color at the north end of the property shows the portion of the site that fronts onto DuPont Street, and then the southerly portion here that fronts onto Herb. It's distinguishing the difference between these designations. So the reddish brown area shows the area that's contemplated for high density, and it would contemplate a building height no greater than 81 meters in this location. The portion of the property or the portion of the site that fronts onto DuPont contemplates medium densities and building heights no greater than 20 meters in that location. Again, when reviewing this application, we're looking at two zoning bylaws. One being Zoning Bylaw 1108, which currently zones the property three different things. So because there are three different properties forming one site, this portion of the site being the old LCBO site or property is C625. This portion is C74, and this is zone GR4, so general residence 4 and commercial 7-4. The suffix on the commercial zone, so the -4 and the -25, represent the maximum permitted stories that are, or the maximum number of stories permitted on those particular categories. Zoning Bylaw 2018-050 is currently under appeal, and it zones the property zone change application. So again, this application was submitted and received by planning approvals prior to the approval of the zoning bylaw by council on September 10th, and as a result, the zone change application zone reflects that a current zoning application is before planning approvals and is currently under review. So the zoning bylaw amendment Z-18-19, which was submitted by the applicant, the request is to rezone the site to C6-25 with site-specific provision. So again, the C6 is a commercial 6 zone, and the 25 reflects a maximum permitted height of 25 stories. The site-specific provisions that the applicant has requested through this application is to establish Herb Street as the front lot line. As previously noted, it has frontage on, the site has frontage on 3 streets, Herb, Pepler, and DuPont. This request is to establish Herb Street as the front lot line from which setbacks can be measured. Typically, in the City of Waterloo, with the exception of Northdale, front lot lines are defined as the shortest lot in the case of a corner lot. The applicant is also looking to reduce flankage yard setbacks and side yard setbacks. They're requesting a permission, or I'll go back a bit, they're reducing the front flankage yard setback to 1 meter from the required 3 meters. They are requesting, the applicant is requesting a reduction in the side yard setback from 0.5 meters from the required 1.5 meters, and they're requesting a permission for density transfer to recognize that there are 2 different maximum permitted densities on the site, back to where the official plan recognizes the medium density on the portion of the site and a high density permissions on a portion of the site. The applicant has also requested an increase in the maximum height over a portion of the site that would not have otherwise permitted the 25 stories or 75 meter maximum height permissions. And the applicant has is requesting a reduction in parking to 252 spaces, whereas 264 is required. And they also wish to include rooftop decks as a portion of the outdoor amenity area within the definition. So the reason for this request is the applicant is looking to submit or to develop a mixed-use building, which would be 24 stories rather in height. It would contain 231 dwelling units or 271 bedrooms, and it would consist of 1 and 2 bedroom units, a density on the site of 550 dwelling units per hectare, ground floor at grade, a commercial rather at grade, for a total of 793 square meters, 252 parking spaces, which would consist of 1 underground level and 3 above ground level parking areas, on-site bicycle parking, which would include indoor and outdoor, and the applicant is proposing to retain the single detached dwelling at 39 DuPont Street East, which was the listed heritage building. This image, and I apologize that it's not as clear as I would like it, but I'll walk you through what this is showing, the conceptual site plan, and this would be for the proposed development. So in this location, there are some road widenings that would be required along Herb Street and Pepler. The building location is here. The applicant is not proposing any building in this location, so this would be an access into and out of the site from DuPont. There would be an access into and out of the site from Herb Street in this location. There is an access into and out of the parking structure, which would form both underground and part of the podium of the building in this location off of Pepler. Now, this access would only access the access from Pepler, rather, would only access the parking structure. This might orient council a bit better. These show perspective renderings of the proposed building. In this location here is Pepler, Herb Street, and DuPont would be in behind. They're proposing a 4-story podium and a 20-story tower that would front onto Herb Street with commercial at the ground floor with activated frontages, which would have doors and windows along the pedestrian realm in this location, and this location here along Pepler. This shows the podium in a bit more detail, showing entrances into the retail or commercial components at grade, and the structure here would be primarily parking with the residential units above contained within the tower. So with their application, the applicant submitted a number of reports, plans, and studies, including a planning justification report, conceptual site plan and building elevations, shadow study, noise study, and a number of other supporting documents. The next step includes staff reviewing the submitted studies, plans, and reports. Part of that review is really going to take a look at a number of things, including the requested height and the density on the site as it relates to both sections of the property, so that which fronts DuPont and that which fronts Herb Street, and of course taking into consideration the frontage along Pepler. The requested setbacks and parking reductions that essentially the site-specific regulations that the applicant has come forward with, any heritage implications that this might have on the existing building on DuPont Street, the context, of course this is uptown, but there are some existing single detached dwellings in that location. We need to review this and comprehensively. Development proposed and any urban design considerations with respect to the built form, massing, and urban design of the building that's being proposed. Public and agency comments, as well as any other items that come forward through the review of the application. And once we've reviewed everything comprehensively and provided a thorough evaluation of the application, staff will have come forward at a later date with a staff report to council for their consideration. And if you haven't, that concludes my presentation. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Rita. Are there questions? Councillor Freeman.
I had a question whether or not during the pre-consultation work, if there was conversation about why the massing is pushed to the back when the parcel along Herb Street closer to Pepler was essentially zoned for the height.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Freeman, we have had initial discussions with the applicant. We've done a preliminary cursory review of what's been submitted to date, and we sat down with the applicant, I believe it was before Christmas at least, if I believe it was in December, to review many components of the development. Part of the discussion was the position of the tower and as it relates to the property as a whole. I will defer that question to the applicant, but my understanding is that the tower is positioned closer to the actual uptown core, and that part of the design was to connect and have that relation to the uptown core. But again, I'll defer the specifics of that to the applicant.
Follow up?
Sorry, my other question was, and I might have missed it in the slide deck, but do you have just like a one sheet that shows what's requested and what's proposed, like in terms of the variant? Is there any variances for parking? I heard you say there was variances for the flankage, side yard, and setback, and yeah, so I see that you want permission for the density transfer. I just didn't know whether you'd kind of put it into a matrix to say, here's what.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Freeman. Ultimately, what's being requested for the density transfer is that they are seeking, because the entirety of the built structure is proposed within that portion of the property, of the site that fronts onto Herb Street. So the request is to allow the density that would otherwise have been permitted on the portion of the site that fronts DuPont to be constructed on the portion of the site that fronts Herb Street. In our zone, in the 1108 zoning bylaw, that is not permitted as a general regulation within that zoning bylaw. In the new zoning bylaw that was approved by council in September, we do include a general regulation that would allow that to occur as of right by any applicant. So ultimately, they've included it as part of their application because the bylaw is under appeal.
So it's a density transfer, but it's not an increase in density. Is
Correct.
that correct? Okay, and then the reduction in parking, do you have a sense of what that is, like the percentage or number of stalls that would be required by bylaw versus the number of stalls being proposed?
Through you, Chair V, to Councillor Freeman, the requested reduction is The requirement through bylaw 1108 is 264 parking spaces based on their proposal. They are requesting 252 spaces. If we look at the new zoning bylaw, that is above what would be required through the new zoning bylaw. I will also add, in addition to the information that's included on this slide, part of the discussion that we had with the applicants back in December were to clarify a lot of the requirements that were put forward. We did note that, for example, a front yard setback was not included in their request, yet their plans show that a front yard setback reduction would be required. We have had extensive conversations with the applicant, and ultimately they may be revising their plans to either conform to the bylaw or to update their submission to include it as a requested relief, and of course the justification that would support that relief. So we continue to, or we have been and will continue to work with the applicants on the various details of the proposal.
Mayor Jaworski.
Thank you, through the chair. I think you partially answered one of my questions regarding the zoning bylaw that they applied under, or the presentation was about, that it was all about our old zoning bylaw, not new one, when in the past 6 months we've seen some that have both. Make it explain, was there a decision, was it a recommendation from city to not compare to the new zoning bylaw, or was it their choice? And that was the end of my question. Okay. Or the end of that question, I'll clarify.
Through you, Chair Veith, to Mayor Jaworski, there's a number of ways I'll answer this question. The first is currently staff need to consider both zoning bylaws in reviewing any application that comes forward. And I mean that in a general sense, because we need to ensure that if there's conflicts between one versus the other, that we're aware of both sides. Secondly, this applicant did come in prior to approval of the new zoning bylaw, so therefore they amended the old bylaw. And the third aspect of this is that staff, as you are very much aware, staff in the city as a whole have worked very hard at reviewing all of the different zoning matters that are contained in the new zoning bylaw, and we believe that it forms part of what good planning should look like, and good planning, good urban design, good form, and good community building. So we will be taking that into consideration, and have been taking that into consideration when we review any application that's before the city. But again, the applicant did submit prior to the zoning bylaw coming into place, and therefore they did amend the previous 1108 bylaw. But there are many things to consider.
Okay. C6 zoning, when I think of that, C is obviously commercial, or not, just in general, the zoning there, commercial. Yet when I look at this, it's going to be essentially 1 floor commercial and 23 dedicated towards the residential. How does that zoning work, that there's essentially, it's essentially residential for all intents and purposes, with a little bit commercial at the basement?
Through you, Chair Veith, to Mayor Jaworski, one of the considerations that staff is looking at in not only this application, but many applications, given this interesting climate where we have 2 different zoning bylaws that we're looking at, is whether or not we evaluate the merits and the structure of the U1 zone, which is our commercial core zone in the new zoning bylaw, and how that's structured. And perhaps there are some tools there that we can use, or some guidelines that we can take from that and the work that we've done to craft that zone for the uptown. I've had discussions again with the applicant in this regard, and they seem amenable to having a conversation about having a zone that may apply to this property that would reflect a lot of the zoning framework in the new zoning bylaw.
Okay, and then finally, could you go back to the slide that has the properties and the zoning, the 3 different properties, that one. So if I look at it seems like the north end of the property, the DuPont side, no development or little development is happening on that piece of property, the side that faces DuPont?
Through you, Chair Veith, to Mayor Jaworski, this portion of the property here, So if you were to draw an imaginary line right straight across, there is no structure proposed to be constructed rather within this section of the property. It will form an access to and from DuPont Street to the site. There is proposed to be on-street parking, but at this point, there is no structure proposed to be constructed on that portion of the property as submitted by the applicant.
So when you do the density transfer, as an example from the GR4, what sort of density do we transfer? Is that like 4 bedrooms?
Ultimately, there is a maximum permitted density. Here, I'll go back a slide. Oh no. Ultimately, there's a maximum permitted density through the official plan. The official plan is the document which establishes the maximum permitted density through the medium density permissions on this portion of the site and the high density permissions on this portion of the site.
And that's the formula that you use? That's the formula that you use for this?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, no, that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bonagor.
Thank you for the information tonight. I was just wondering just about those rooftop decks as outdoor amenity space. Is that something that's replacing something that would usually be at ground level, or is this supplemental to any kind of outdoor thing that would be on the ground floor?
Through you, Chair Veith, ultimately the amenity space requirements are one in the new zoning bylaw and in the previous zoning bylaw, but how it's defined in the new zoning bylaw and the old zoning bylaw are a bit different. The old zoning bylaw does not permit rooftop amenity space to be included within the amenity area calculations, but in the new zoning bylaw it does. So ultimately the applicant is requesting that the new definition of amenity space and what constitutes that amenity space would be included. So ultimately amenity space is defined as rooftop decks or patios. It could be internal space for amenity purposes on the property. Conversely, or the opposite, not the opposite, but in addition, rather, there is also landscaped open space, which reflects more of the green space at grade, which is a different definition, just for comparison purposes.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Freeman.
On the topic of amenity space, I noticed that it said that they were asking to be able to use the rooftop terrace as an amenity, but from a square footage or a square meter perspective, do they have the amount of amenity that is requested under the calculation in the new bylaw? So it's, I think, 3 square meters per bedroom versus, is that right?
So through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Freeman, that is part of our review, is to take a look at what are they requesting and what have they provided. At this time, they have not requested a reduction in the total amount of amenity space required through the bylaw. The new zoning bylaw, you're correct, does require 3 square meters per bedroom. So that is something that we will be evaluating through the application. How much amenity space are they providing and where are they providing it? And is there any programmed use for those spaces as well?
Councillor Vasic.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, I guess I'm just curious about the 1 and 2 bedroom. Maybe this is related to the density conversation and I'm just not there with my knowledge yet. But I guess through the campaigning, I got this understanding that Uptown was trying to move to different sizes of units to accommodate different groups who want to live together. So like, now I know that we're not doing person zoning or person whatever, but like this doesn't really allow for family units. Is that a direction that the city is moving in? Why is it just 1 to 2 bedroom units? And I think that also is difficult for students to live uptown as well in these kind of newer builds. So just curious about the 1 to 2 bedroom and if why not more?
Through you, Councillor Veith, to Chair Veith, to Councillor Vasic. It's a great question. Typically, it's a question that I'll relay to the applicant. However, typically in in our team, we want to see a mix and range of unit types. So that includes not only your single detached dwellings and multiple dwellings, but also a range in number of bedrooms that we see in each dwelling unit. So it is something that we encourage. However, the marketability or the pro forma and the numbers, the dollars and cents behind it is something that I believe the applicant will likely want to respond to.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Freeman has one more.
Promise this is my last one. On the site plan, it looks like they're planning to retain that house on DuPont. Is that because the HIA identified it as being of historical significance? Do they have a plan for that house?
Through you, Chair Veith, to Councillor Freeman, they are proposing to retain the existing home, the existing single detached dwelling on the property. I showed in a photo here. My understanding is the significance ties to its vernacular architecture. It has, an HIA was completed, it's being reviewed by our heritage planner. My understanding is that the applicant has been to the Municipal Heritage Committee, and their motions will form part of the information that we receive and review as part of the application.
Thank you. I see no more questions. I'll ask for our next delegation, who is Bruce Hall. Welcome, Mr. Hall.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Mr. Mayor, members of council, staff, and the public. My name is Bruce Hall, and I'm a partner and planner with the Planning Partnership, and we act on behalf of Paramount Development Group, who are the applicants for a zoning bylaw amendment for 3642 and 39 DuPont Street East. I apologize, my throat is a bit raw, so I'll try to get through this. You've had a long day, and Ms. Hardacre did a very thorough job, so I'll try not to duplicate any of her discussion, and I'll only focus on things where it was important to the formulation of our plan. I'm here by myself tonight. I don't have a big team with me. There was a big team involved in this application, and unfortunately a number of them were not available, but we'll make sure that if we have future meetings for certainly within the community, I'll make them available, and as well at the statutory public meeting. We've been working on this application for quite some time, well over a year now. We did come in under the old zoning bylaw, but that was not a last-ditch attempt just to slide it in. We've been working on it. We had a number of discussions with the region, which went on for several months about road widenings, and that took a long time to get resolved. We didn't really want to start formulation of our plan until we'd had that resolved, because it materially affects the design from the ground, from the basement all the way up. I'm going to try to respond to some of the deferrals that Natalie made to me, but I didn't remember them all, so please feel free to remind me. Just one point, though, about the heritage component. That was right from the beginning something that we decided to do before we'd even retained a heritage consultant. It retains the streetscape of DuPont. It's an existing, quite a lovely home, and it provides rental accommodation. So the plan is to keep it as it exists today. It's, I believe, 3 apartments, and to maintain it as rental accommodation. So in terms of the area context, I'm not going to repeat everything, but really, this is a relatively large intensification site, which is ideally situated to optimize the investments that have been made in transit in Uptown Waterloo and a range of existing services and infrastructure. And the attributes which really make it ideally situated and why we're bringing it forward are its location in Uptown Waterloo, which is the urban growth center. It's a 2-minute walk to King Street. It has the Ion rail stops located very close by, and there's a number of existing community services, amenities, and civic institutions that are available today. The Uptown Urban Growth Center and major transit station area is a location that's in flux, and the timing and its location is right for development to occur. Uptown is transitioning into a more intense urban mixed-use environment. There's been very significant investments in infrastructure. Unlike some other environments, the amenities are already in place, i.e. the parks. And there are employment opportunities that exist and are growing in the area, and these can serve those and vice versa. Again, the transportation is one of the key components, and probably the key benefit to this area is its high degree of access to roads, transit, and active transportation. It's within 200 to 250 meters of the LRT, and 2 stations are within 500 meters, which puts it at, elevates its attractiveness in terms of active transportation. Not only that, this site is situated between a number of very important elements within Waterloo, and being on the Laurel Trail, it connects it through active transportation right from the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier through Waterloo Park into the downtown and up into Moses Springer Park and the community center. And one of the discussions we had with Ms. Hardacre at our last meeting was, and it's really becoming more and more obvious, is the way that trail cuts across the corner of the site is a real opportunity. And we're going to work with staff and the urban design and our urban designers to try to elevate the way that those two things connect together, physically, visually, as well as there's maybe an opportunity to create some public art there and really highlight that. And I mean, you can see this site from Waterloo City Hall, and it's really well connected to this trail, which is quite mature. It's been here since I went to Waterloo a long time ago, and I think that's a real thing that we have to elevate. In terms of the existing planned and built context, and I apologize, this is a little hard to see, it's at the center of an area which contains a broad range of existing and planned development of different forms, scale, and heights, which are, the proposal is similar to and falls within that range. There's a number of planned buildings, and when I say planned, both applications that are currently before you or have been recently approved in Uptown Waterloo. Higher density, take advantage of the transit investments, and it's recognizing it as an urban growth center, including 70, 80 King and the Barrel Yards redevelopment. I'm not going to spend any more time than that. In terms of the immediate neighborhood context, Herb Street is largely commercial in nature. DuPont is sort of more of a mix of some commercial and residential. I think as you move away from Pepler towards King Street, you see that sort of change occur to more commercial in nature. And again, it's very strategically located at the confluence of the Laurel Trail in this site. So within this neighborhood context, you have a variety of building types and densities and heights, including some of the tallest buildings within the Uptown core, Water Park Place to the east, and the Marsden Center to the west. And at the end of the spectrum, you have some of the lower scale, lower density development on DuPont Street, which is a mix of commercial and residential. In terms of the site context, Natalie has thoroughly explained. I'm happy to elaborate on anything you have, but we have 3 sites, which, individually on their own are really not contributing much to the planned vision for the Uptown core, but together, these sites taken together comprise almost an acre of land. and provide a real opportunity for intensification. Oops, sorry. So as Natalie explained, these are 3 sites, 42, 36 Herb, 39 DuPont. In terms of the heritage component, 39 DuPont Street was always intended to be retained as it exists today. We will go through a process with staff and the Heritage Advisory Committee of determining how this dwelling and this heritage resource is best protected. We will likely work together to create an easement, a heritage easement on this property, which basically protects it in perpetuity, transfers the density over to the other sites as were discussed, and allows that DuPont streetscape to be maintained. And as Natalie indicated, there are no structures that are proposed for that finger which goes out to DuPont. It's going to be used for parking as it is today. There is access. I think one of the discussions we will have with staff is how does the access for this site work? Is there a way to limit impacts upon the adjacent neighborhoods? We may look at establishing some patterns of limiting access going in or going out into some of these areas. And that's a discussion we'll have as this is further reviewed through this process and site plan. I'm going to try to keep this brief. We see the combination of these properties coming together as forming a very substantial development site within the Uptown Core to meet its objectives. It's almost an acre, as I said. It's less than 200 meters from King Street. It's a very strategic and scenic location on the Laurel Trail. And these sites on their own are significantly underutilized, but when they come together, they provide beneficial opportunities for intensification. These next few slides are the planning framework, and I'm going to fly right through them because Natalie has done a very thorough job in dealing with that. Again, the proposed building, Natalie has covered that in a lot of detail. We had always intended to come in with the height in accordance with the official plan and the existing zoning bylaw 1108. It's a 24-story versus 25-story building. It's a 4-story podium with the tower set back above. We have 231 residential units made up of about 190 one-bedrooms and 42 bedrooms plus den. I think I'm answering one of the questions. The unit sizes range from about 500 or 600 square feet up to 1,200 square feet. We are limited by the density in the official plan in terms of number of bedrooms. That's a conversation we can have. A lot of those units are substantial enough that they could accommodate 3-bedroom family-size units, and that's a growing trend within a lot of urban areas, is to allow families to live in high-density areas and have family-size units. It can certainly be accommodated. We have an issue with official plan conformity, so it's another issue we can have a conversation about. We have almost 6,000 square feet of indoor amenity, 16,000 square feet of outdoor amenity. The discussion about the outdoor amenity was, I'm not sure that it's correct to say that the current zoning bylaw does not permit rooftop to be included as outdoor. I just don't think it anticipates it. It's a concept that is more contemporary, and the previous zoning bylaw may just not have anticipated it. And we certainly meet the standard under the existing zoning bylaw and far exceed the standard under the new zoning bylaw. Our approach when we came forward was not to try to cherry pick and pick what was good in one bylaw and what was good in another. We really wanted to come in as much in accordance with the existing zoning bylaw as we could, with the exception of some of the changes that were made to some of the setbacks for the yards. And those are really an effort to push the building as far forward as we can to Herb Street and provide as much of a setback between the rear property line of the DuPont Street properties. We also didn't anticipate to have to give a 3 to 4 meter road widening when we started the process, and once that's taken out, it really limits our ability to have a functional and viable underground garage layout, and that's why we've sort of pushed to the sides and pushed to the street. If we are going to have a conversation about bringing this into the new zoning bylaw, and as Ms. Hardacre indicated, I'm sorry I'm flipping between Natalie and Ms. Hardacre, but as she indicated, the new zoning bylaw anticipates a much lower parking standard. If we're going to look to doing that, certainly it's probably supportable given the location in the uptown core and the transit accessibility. That will have other implications in terms of either dropping down the height by getting rid of a floor of the garage and moving some things at grade underground. We're limited to that because of the partially being within the floodway. Sorry, I'm jumping around quite a bit here. In terms of the site plan, as I said, the building is very purposely been oriented towards Herb Street and really pushed to that frontage to minimize, to maximize the setback to these rear yards. There was a question about the side yards. Again, that's the same thing. We're trying to get a lot of stuff here as close as we can to DuPont. So we've looked for some relief on those. The conversation we've had with staff about is they want us to look at trying to increase those. So again, as a conversation as part of parking, that can be looked at. And again, there's no structure that is proposed along DuPont. The ground floor commercial, and typically mixed use refers to a building that has grade level commercial and then residential above. There's about almost 8,000 square feet of commercial. And the important thing about doing that is it really is intended to activate both Herb Street and Pepler in terms of contributing to the concept of uptown and being a very vibrant pedestrian area. One of the discussions we've had about staff is actually looking at pushing some of the space at grade back a little bit, creating a bit more of a colonnade to allow for a wider sidewalk, and that's something else what will occur through further discussions and through site plan. The amenity that we're talking about at the 5th level, this is indoor amenity area, and this everything that surrounds it is outdoor with some green space here. This slide illustrates the relationship to DuPont. We have about almost 20 meters setback. The building currently now, the former LCBO building, sits almost right on the property line. We're now putting the building back closer towards Herb Street. There is some outside bicycle storage proposed within this area intervening, but it won't involve any structure, likely be caged. I'm not going to really go into the heritage impact assessment much, except to say that the purpose of the report was to not only address the existing heritage resources, but how this fits within the heritage context. And in order to achieve a better fit and conservation, they've provided for a number of conservation and mitigation recommendations. These will form part of a heritage conservation plan, which will form part of the heritage easement and be registered against the property on title. Natalie reviewed the next steps. What I'm going to say to that is we are waiting the formal comments from the various departments, and once we have those, then we will start to look at what changes we make to various aspects of the building. We'd rather do that all at the same time. As she said, we've met with planning. We have some informal comments regarding height and massing. We've agreed to continue these discussions with staff and to have them resolved through engagement and likely even sort of a design working session with staff in urban design, and then to look at how we can in detail implement possible refinements. One of the discussions that Natalie has indicated is very important is how we address the new zoning bylaw. We did not know where the new zoning bylaw was going to land in terms of height because it sort of bounced all over the place as the various versions were going around. At 60 meters, it's about a 15-meter height difference, which is, say, 4 stories or 5 stories. We're very open to looking at alternatives. Really, for us, it's important about density and the number of units, and the height is not as critical. So I'm going to say, without prejudice right now, we're very open to looking at how that density might be distributed or massed on the site. This councillor here, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, she had asked a question about why the building was pushed to sort of the tower was pushed to the western side. We'd initially come into the pre-con. I wasn't at the pre-con meeting, but the building had been closer to Pepler, and some of the discussions with staff were, as Natalie said, push it over towards the King Street and the Uptown core, because that's where the density is. Maybe there's a way that this can be stepped down. It ends up being a larger floor plate, but that's a design exercise and a discussion. So my last point is we met with the Heritage Advisory Committee before Christmas to present the proposal. We had a very good dialogue, and like the planning discussions, we will continue to work with them. That's my approach. Had very successful initiatives with a number of Heritage Advisory Committees where we plan on going back there more than once, and we plan on working with them and to come out with a development that everybody can live with. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions for the delegation? Councillor Bonnegar?
Thank you. Through you, Chair Veith. Thank you for all of that information. It's really helpful. Laurel Creek flows right by, if not underneath, this parcel of land. And I know that you've mentioned underground parking. I'm just wondering if you could give a bit of better understanding how those two things mesh and what kind of protections will be in place for the creek.
I really wish I had my engineer here tonight. One of the things that there's 3 things that you have to achieve to satisfy the GRCA. One is what they call safe access. 2 is floodproofing to the regional flood elevation. And the 3rd one I'm trying to remember is, anyways, we've achieved 2 of 3. The safe access is achieved to the 100-year storm and not in the regional event. And that's, we don't have our GRCA comments yet, and that'll be a very, very important discussion because I understand that's been an issue with development on this site in the past. We have a very capable engineer who's on that project who's done a lot of work. We're providing some additional information that has been asked by the region, and that will be forthcoming as well.
And can you give us some idea of the timeline for this plan and your intentions towards holding public information sessions? Because I expect there will be a lot of public input.
Yeah. I don't have any preconceived ideas about additional public engagement above and beyond this meeting and the public information, the statutory public meeting. But we are very open to doing that, similar to the way we've discussed working with the Heritage Advisory Committee. So if you want us to come out and meet in the community on an evening or an afternoon or something, particularly as it relates to possibly the way that the interaction of the Laurel Creek Trail comes across the site and water management issues, we can bring our consultants out on site. So we're happy to do it.
Mayor Jaworski.
Just a quick question. I think you mentioned you represent the Paramount Development Group. They have any other projects locally or of note that we should know?
They are primarily a developer. They've done some overseas work. They would be in the future development and building of this, they would be partnering with a builder-developer partner. So I can forward some information on through the clerk's office.
Yeah, that'd be handy. Thank you.
My apologies, I should be speaking through the chair.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I see there's no more questions for you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else here tonight that would like to speak to this application? Please come forward and tell us your name and where you live.
I'm Stephen Herzog from Elgin Street. I'll try to be very brief. One concern I have is cyclists in the area, and whether this, I guess, is a question that Natalie might be able to answer. There's been some talk of a bike lane on Herb Street, and would that be contemplated on the north side or the south side or both? And how would that interact with the vehicular access to the building?
Okay.
And I don't need an answer now. Just
Thank you for coming back this evening.
Okay.
Are there any questions for the delegation? No. Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Jason LeBay. I live at 41 DuPont, which is directly east of the property and directly north. Some of my considerations are the amount of traffic that would be generated by this. 250 parking spots represents 500 trips a day in the area. Pepler and DuPont become one-lane streets in the wintertime. Parking gets to be 4 or 5 feet out into the street. So accommodating 500 trips a day would be very difficult. It's difficult as it is to get in and out through there. People being what they are will not go east to go west, so they will not go on Herb Street and then go turn around the block. They will try to go Pepler and DuPont. This would require street lights at the Pepler and Bridgeport and also Pepler and Herb Street intersections. You can wait there for a very long time as it is, so adding that much traffic in the area would really back things up. So that has to be a consideration. Street widening on DuPont would require expropriation of 3 meters of land of all the properties that were there. A few years ago, there was a sewage or upgrade done on DuPont Street, and that narrowed the street by 3 feet. So accommodating extra traffic right now would not be possible the way it is. My personal concerns are that there is no mention or pictures of my garage, which is in the back of the lot. It is approximately 5 feet, almost exactly 5 feet from the back of the old liquor store. Tearing down this property would probably cut into my property. I make my living in this building. I'm a potter, so I work there every day. I am concerned about the building, the construction, how it would affect me. There's a large Norwegian spruce on my property, which probably has roots into the property adjacent, which would be in question, and digging along there would probably kill that tree, which City Hall made sure that I kept when I built my garage. They said, you must keep that tree. So I'm concerned about that. Just general concerns about how the construction would affect the neighborhood, those of us living there at this time. My studio definitely has to be considered. So the setbacks on the backside where it's mentioned the possibility of bicycle parking, that's a concern. I don't know if they plan to put up a new fence to divide the properties. The property at 39 DuPont shares a large cedar hedge with my property. So I saw a diagram where there was a proposed large transformer for the back lot of 39 DuPont. None of that has been mentioned here. I'm just concerned on the whole about that size. I mean, let alone a 25-story building in my backyard. You know, I have worked on that backyard, landscaped it. I have a koi pond, I have a deck. It's a beautiful little oasis in the middle of the city, which is going to fall in complete darkness for most of the time once this building goes up. But mainly it's the construction, you know, how guarantee my safety and my grandchildren's safety who are in the backyard while you're putting up a building of this size right next door. And as just to speak to the heritage point on 39 DuPont, the only difference between that house and my house, they were both built by the Jacobys back in 1888, is the front porch. And that's not much of a, it's falling apart. So I don't think that there's a heritage designation that would say keep that building. The building plan, you see thousands of buildings exactly the same size, same design all over the city. So it's that's not really a question that I'm concerned with. But in order to do anything on that site requires the expropriation of 3 meters for future street widening, and that's information I got from City Hall here before. So that would impact all of the properties that are on DuPont as well for street widening. Okay.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Labbe, and for coming. And make sure that you connect with staff and that you've signed the registry so you can get further updates. And of course, your city councillor would be happy to chat with you as well. So anyway, one last call for anyone out there that wishes to speak to this. Okay, thank you, everyone. No more delegations. This informal public meeting is now concluded. Staff will review the issues and provide further reporting to council at a later date. Okay, we're almost finished, right? Consideration of notice of motion given at a previous meeting. There is none. No notice of motion. Communications and correspondence, none. Regional information and correspondence, page 17 of the packet. Unfinished business, anyone? Councillor Freeman?
Sorry to bring this up. It's rink season. And with the change in temperature and it staying warmer a lot, some of the local volunteers really want to use tarps to help keep the water in place. And as you know, people use them in their backyards, they use them in their front yards, and we've got a 30-year-old policy that says we don't use tarps. Good reason for it. It has to do with potential flooding if the tarp lets go, potential damage to environmentally sensitive areas where oftentimes these rinks are placed. And also, potential flooding onto people's properties, right? So not only potential flooding onto our property, but onto other people's properties. And I guess erosion if that water were to release quickly. I guess the question becomes, can we position ourselves to look at these independently and actually assess the actual potential impacts of something like that based on the actual location as opposed to working on the blanket policy for the city? And, I realize this is, if we want to review the whole policy, fine, but I'm suggesting that maybe we create an opportunity to review them independently based on the sites. And quite simply, I think having access to outdoor rinks is wonderful. And it's so much work for volunteers to get these going, to keep them going, and the ability to utilize a tarp in some locations will make all the difference in the world in terms of their ability to keep them going. And I don't know, I really value staff's input on this, and Jeff Mark and Jeff have been really great to return my emails on this. It's just, I think it's a council decision to decide whether or not we want to look at these as one-offs. And so maybe staff can give us some insight into this and whether it's possible to look at them one-off so that people can actively recreate in the winter in some locations where it makes sense to use tarps.
Could that be a briefing note, perhaps? Mark?
Yes, through Chair Veith to Councillor Freeman and the rest of council. Yes, with the some of the more mild weather, the rink season comes a little shorter for our volunteers in our local neighborhoods. In some location, tarps are being used considering the slopes. So I think maybe a review of one-off, we can do that. We are aware, and in Councillor Vasek's ward, there has been issues where, what you speak to of the tarps holding water and then breaking away have caused significant claim and issues for some of the residents in those areas and impacts. So we can take the request away and look at it further and provide an update to council in the form of a briefing note or email in the future here.
Thank you very much. Any more unfinished business? Thank you. New business? None? Any questions? Would anybody like to adjourn this meeting? Councillor Henry? Councillor Freeman? All in favor? Thank you, everyone.